Hello, and welcome to this very special episode. All of my episodes, all my videos special. This one very, very, very special because I've brought Lokey back one last time. Lokey.
The last time? Oh my. Is this going to be the final farewell? Am I going to be shipped off in a coffin now? Set out to sea?
I've squeezed all the utility I can get out of you, and now I will throw you aside like a piece of trash.
Aw, darn.
But before I do, let's talk a bit about the Abyssal Archive.
Oh yes, because right now that I have my 2 volumes of Dark Souls lore has finally released. In digital format. Excellent. Specifically.
And where can people go to access that?
You can actually, if you've already pre-ordered back in August when we were first doing the big pre-order promotion, then check your email. There's going to be links and instructions on how to get your free download for the digital version while you wait for your physical copy to come in eventually in the mail. Again, publishers working tirelessly to try to get that all out as soon as possible. Quality's looking great. Everything seems to be working smoothly so far. So again, we'll have more updates for you in the future. Again, just follow the publisher at Tune and Fairweather. The digital version, if you want to buy it separately, again, you can go to Tune and Fairweather's website and their purchase page. Again, links will be in the description. You can then be able to buy your own digital edition. Again, if you were kind of like on the fence about getting it because you're like, I really want to get it. That's some good quality. I really like it. I'm interested in the topic, but it's a little bit outside my price range right now, or it's going to take me a while to be able to get that much or whatever. Don't worry. Completely understand. You buy the digital version. It's much, much cheaper for you if you just want to be able to have something you can read on the go or whatever. And then maybe later, if you feel like it's worth getting the physical edition, you can do that too. Either way, you're supporting me. I don't mind. I'm happy either way, and I'm glad to get the information out there into people's hands to read. So again, it's Abyssal Archive, 2 volumes of a lore analysis of the original Dark Souls. Buy it now.
Buy it now, ladies and gentlemen. And if we haven't convinced you to do it with our, we did 2 collaboration videos prior to this.
Yes.
This is our ultimate sell here, our big Gwyn Lost in Translation talk.
Yeah, because Gwyn is a quite an important character to speak about, so definitely worth digging into him and sort of get an idea of not only just how much lore is lost in translation, but also just how especially when you look at some of the older From Software titles from Miyazaki, how much of that, how much of just the general story of Dark Souls can end up changing, even sometimes in just the small minutia of details, by just looking over at these things, as well as some of the broad strokes. So again, very, very good topic that you selected.
Thank you. So, without any further delays, do you want to get going?
Ooh, you first.
We definitely didn't record the following conversation a few months ago.
Shh. I had basically 3 pillars that I discussed, and the idea was that it would be lithology, archaeology, and psychology, or text, environment, character. The point was that you can just look at these, and I think these are basically common sense, is that you just read what the text says, look at what the environment shows you, and then sort of take what you can infer and understand about the characters, and then sort of put that all together. You have to do some balancing, obviously, for various other factors, but it all comes together to tell you what the author is trying to convey to you, right? And yes. This has been done in obviously not just Dark Souls, in tons of games. You see this in Elder Scrolls, you see this in Dragon Age, you see this in Mass Effect, you see this in a lot of stuff. The only real difference is that Dark Souls and From Software games since Miyazaki have been generally more leaning into the show don't tell, and in some cases tell don't tell. And the idea is basically to have that all of these factors should be able to tell you what the story is. But there's been a problem, and it's always led to so many issues across the entire Dark Souls series. The localization. It's not perfect. In fact, it's very far from perfect. And that has resulted in the text, one of the major 3 pillars for me, to not be at a sufficient quality for people to analyze and be able to actually understand the Dark Souls narrative. And I've said this before in past podcasts when we were talking about Demon Souls and Bloodborne and things like this. Demon Souls and Dark Souls, the original, have the worst localizations of the bunch. And this has a huge cascading effect on later games, because obviously Dark Souls, you get sequels, you expect sequels to build on their predecessors, and if you're not understanding the original properly, then you're not going to understand the sequel properly either, and what it's talking about and things like that.
Especially when the games abandon terminology, or when the games themselves have to change the terminology subsequently because they already use this terminology here when another word may have been more appropriate for the phenomena they were describing back then.
Right, so, like, for example, a very simple example of this is how in Dark Souls 1, all the priests are called bishops in the localization. Well, it's like, that's an extremely weird translation by itself. But then, what happens is that then you get into Dark Souls 3, and suddenly Dark Souls 3 has bishops. And it's like, well, what are they going to do? Well, they decide they're going to call the bishops deacons. So now it's this huge mess up. So it's like, oh, yes, okay, so the deacons are actually bishops, and the bishops are actually priests, and it's like, oh my god, imagine trying to... You have to now kind of explain how the hierarchy works here.
Yeah, Lokey actually told me this before we started recording, but the Deacons of the Deep are supposed to be called the Bishops of the Blob, right?
No. Oh, yeah, sure, Blob. Yeah, okay, sounds about right.
The Bishops of the Below. How does that sound?
The Depths?
No, that doesn't start with a B. It doesn't start with a B.
You just want a B in there, don't you? Can't be a D.
Yeah, the Deacons of the Deep, that sounds like a band.
Well, it has a better ring to it, admittedly, but again, like I said, doesn't mean it's right.
Yeah. But yeah, this is a good preamble. Now let's get going. So the story of Gwyn, first of all, we've had on the bullet points, you have written that Gwyn is arguably Miyazaki's best villain. Is that something you want to talk about before we get diving?
Yeah, because it's true.
Is it though? I have a lot of patience for Alant. I think he's a pretty cool guy.
Oh no, he's good, but here's the thing. Alant has a bad reputation. Gwyn manages to come off as being the most popular guy in the world. You can't say that many Miyazaki villains have managed to pull that off, especially considering what Gwyn did.
Yeah, but Loki, maybe you're just looking at it the wrong way. Maybe Gwyn isn't all bad. Have you thought about that?
Oh, I see. Yeah, he's actually the hero of the story.
Well, I mean, I feel like you're just being a bit too negative. And look, I did get some of those comments on my Gwyn video. I understand the sentiment. I disagree with it completely, that Gwyn... everybody has redeeming qualities, right? Gwyn, he was probably pretty nice to his dog. But no, he is the bad guy. He is the absolute villain of this world. And all of these horrors that we see in Dark Souls that accumulate over the series, this is his doing. You cannot disconnect Gwyn from, the horrible stagnation of the world you're seeing in Dark Souls 3. That's all causally attributable to Gwyn.
Yeah, the most superficial read of the game would be, oh, Gwyn did nothing wrong, or Gwyn is a good guy. Let's say that people will acknowledge he did something wrong. But it's any deeper look into the game, as soon as you start peeling back the layers, Gwyn looks worse and worse. There's really no qualification that you can put to that.
Yeah. These games also have a reputation of you just interpret your own lore, and I think that's totally valid if you just want to headcanon your own sort of story, but these games...
And I mean, it's pretty much promoted by Miyazaki. He wants you... Again, It's not that Miyazaki, has... Miyazaki's very clear, especially in interviews and stuff, that there is, of course, a lore, there is a canon, quote-unquote. But he doesn't want to just hand the canon to you. He wants you to come to the answer. And if you come to the wrong answer, I mean, it's a win-win for him, right? Because, you think you got the right answer, and, what's that matter? You still love the game because of it.
Yeah.
So, he may be a little bummed if you didn't get it, but, he'll just try again next time. Or, we see in Dark Souls 3, he'll just make it explicit so you can't miss it.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing, that even though these games are very open-ended and you are expected to interpret the events, they are still exploring certain ideas, and there are better and worse ways of connecting those ideas to the events in the world. And if you get hung up on a certain nuance of the lore, say you interpret Gwyn to be kind of a tragic, heroic figure, that's going to be very detrimental to your ability to actually see the larger ideas that are at play. And
it's putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah. And his interactions, his relationships with other characters, and the things that he does, they aren't going to make as much... They're not going to be very coherent in the light of that reading. Whereas, everything connects very tightly if you just accept that Gwyn is a bad guy.
Well, you don't have to accept that Gwyn is the bad guy doing so. It's just that's where the evidence leads. Like again,
Yeah.
it's not like we're saying this and then we're doing so. It's like anyone who looks at the game is gonna probably like has a serious look at the game and peels under the layers is gonna come away with that. It's like it's hard to say not to. Like it's hard to make a justification for a lot of what Gwyn does.
Yeah. Yeah. So the story of Dark Souls. We begin. The world is kind of stone. And when they say stone, it's like actually stone, but it's also stone in the sense that it's just this unmoving, gray, almost immaterial, just sort of, it's a thing that is, and it's not affected by anything. It's just a complete sort of empty space.
Right. So, it's not. Well, here's the thing.
Yeah.
The opening cinematic for Dark Souls lies to you right off the bat by saying, "In the Age of Ancients, the world was unformed." No. You can see in the cinematic it has plenty of form.
There's a lot of trees
what they're
there.
Saying, yeah. There's trees, there's dragon, like there's plenty of form. There's dragon form, tree form, rock form. The point isn't that it's unformed. The point is that there are no differences. That's what the Japanese is actually getting at to you.
Yeah.
And that's what it's trying to establish, right? You have this old age where things were all one uniform element, namely rock, right? The dragons were rock, the trees were rock, the rock was rock, everything's just rock.
Mm-hmm.
And then that changed when fire came into existence. And as soon as fire came into existence, it irreversibly changed everything, because now there was no longer just everything existing as rock. There were now different states and of existence. So again, and this is where we get the idea of life and death, heat and cold, all that jazz, right?
Yes.
And again, I talk about this more in depth for the Cosmology of Abyssal Archive, but suffice to say, the idea is that basically we start seeing change and evolution and all these things that help sort of give us the world as we see it today, right?
Yeah.
Souls are the power of disparity itself. Like, this becomes extremely explicit in Dark Souls 3, where the Firekeeper, she just says that outright in the Japanese script when you're doing the whole level up thing, and she has her little mantra. But, like, it becomes clear in Dark Souls 1, 2, just looking at just, again, various pieces in the environment and the text and things like that, that souls are disparity itself, and that disparity brings with it change, and that also, and part of that change is, of course, life.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's how they justify in world that you're imbibing the disparity, and that elevates your stats. Like, you can become stronger. You can increase your faith by imbibing this material.
Well, yeah, it's a little more complicated with that because you have to deal
Yeah.
with firekeepers and things like that. It's different from, obviously, the natural process of how people grow and develop and things. But yes, that is the same basic concept. Like, it sort of builds on Demon Souls' idea where the soul is the source of thought, but also just the general concept of the source of possibility. You see that very much, is that they are the souls are a source of life and disparity, change, right? So they can change and remold and add on to you in ways that didn't exist before, right? So, like, again, if rock is the unmoving stone, like the forever enduring, like, you put a rock there, it's going to be there forever. Obviously, erosion and stuff happens, but again, we're talking about, like, the general historical concept of, like, a rock is just, it's always there, it'll forever be there, right?
Yeah.
Then you add fire and disparity in there. Well, that rock doesn't just stay there. It's now, it starts getting morphed and changed, and like the heat starts melting parts of it and stuff like that. You'll have, obviously, there's a side of the rock now that's lit up by the fire, and the side that's not lit up by the fire is now in shadow, right? So it's all these ideas sort of come together. And that's eventually brings us to all the various living races that we actually see in the universe.
Yes, and races is an important qualifier because humans, Gwyn is not one of us. Gwyn is not a human being.
Yeah, so this becomes especially clear. Like, so the gods are always described as a clan. So this is something that's always important to do so. And clan of, this is again going back to our concept when we were talking about Latria in Demon Souls, is that the idea is like, okay, well, the queen, she wasn't just her family got locked up. The idea was her clan, because it wasn't just her, the royal, but also the nobility and the noble classes, the entire aristocracy, and all of them have been intermarrying and things forever and do so. Everyone's sort of loosely related to each other, and it very much like a tribal thing. Same thing that you see in like Dark Souls 2, for example. When Navlon gets executed, it's not him and all of his village, it's him and his clan. So again, because the localization probably went with the idea of, like everyone in your village you're probably related to, so they treat that as kind of like the clan thing. But again, the point is that you have this broad strokes of people who you are in some ways have some blood relation and kinship to, that they're defining it. And we see this, of course, obviously with, like, say, the mimics, for example. Like, despite being gods, certain clan end up being turned in being branded with this bottomless box that turns them into like the monster that we know in the game, right? So this idea is that, okay, so the gods are supposed to be an actual clan, a tribe, and I think that you got that across really well in your video. But what's important is like, okay, well, what is that clan? And in fantasy settings, obviously, clan will often be used just to denote entire races and things like that.
Yeah,
you see something similar happen in Dark Souls 2 with the Lion Clan. It sort of refers to this entire race of lion people, and the point with Dark Souls 1 is that, okay, well, the gods are supposed to be their own clan. Well, okay, what are the clan of the gods then? And like, what happens when because some characters, as we see, they seem to be part of the clan of the gods, but they're not necessarily gods themselves, or they're not referred to as gods, or somewhat ambiguous and things like that. So in order to simplify things, when we're talking about, okay, well, this character is like instead of saying like a character is like half god because they don't have a god as a status, then I refer to them as the medials. So like they're generally shown to be between the size of like the human/pygmies and the giants. So it's like, okay, they'll be the medials, and that's something that'll Abyssal Archive goes in, and it's a very simple, easy way to refer to it. So we're not constantly saying, the tribe of the gods, tribe of Gwyn or something like that.
Because it's also important to note that the qualifier god is really bad when you're talking about the race, because they also use god to refer to status. Like godhood is
it's something you could take away.
Yeah.
You can marry into it. It's this thing that's sort of like you have. It's sort of, again, it's like a noble title is how it's treated in the series. And
Exactly.
obviously, how do you determine? It's not even necessarily the race of the medials who can be gods, because obviously, like Dark Souls 2, for example, has like Ferris become deified subsequent after death, right? So you have like tons of examples where, okay, well, humans can be worshipped as gods. In Dark Souls 3, you have a tree which is being worshipped as a god. So like you have tons of examples of where, like, okay, well, godhood is something that's very much much like in real life. It's a term that has a lot of baggage attached to it, but it's very much a status of something to describe something. It doesn't refer to something's inherent traits. None of the gods in Dark Souls were inherently gods, like say in like mythology, where it's like they're born out of the ether, and then like sort of they're just like these godlike entities by themselves, right? They were just another race in the universe, right? And it's not until we see the introduction of the Lord Souls that they start having the powers and abilities that make them associated with godhood. Yeah, and it's important to note, like, okay, well, where does the clan lie as far as races are concerned? Well, we know, obviously, that the Japanese text clarifies that Nito's boss room is not just any room, like any chamber. It's actually supposed to be the chamber where the gods rest. So the point is that, and we see this in-game, like, we see the one coffin that's next to Nito. It's got a bunch of these bones that are much larger than human bones, generally speaking, that are sort of just laying there at the bottom and things, and you can actually see another coffin way in the back behind Nito, behind some rocks and things like that, and it sort of kind of gives the impression that there's probably more of them, probably somewhere hiding behind the crags and things, but the idea basically is that this is supposed to be the god's burial chamber, and a bunch of gods are supposed to be actually buried there. So it's like, okay, so this is where the medials are getting buried, at least after they start calling themselves gods. And as we can see, that's really literally right next door to where their giant slaves are being buried. And as we can see, it isn't just their giant slaves. There's a bunch of other races, like giant beasts and things like that, that seem to be related and are ancestors to the modern day giants that we know of. So again, this idea seems to be this is an ancestral burial ground, and the medials seem to be some sort of subspecies or different branch on that evolutionary tree.
But of course, before becoming gods, before being buried with Nito, then medials, they have nothing.
Yeah, they were. So what happens is that we understand like the state that they were in before they find the Lord Souls. One because of the cinematic, the other because of Quelana's attire. So with the cinematic, what we're told is when the quote-unquote lords find their Lord Souls, they are referred to as they in the cinematic in the English side. But the Japanese side actually clarifies that it's supposed to be like some, and the idea is specifically it's supposed to be referring to some animals, right? So the idea is that these, at the time, they weren't even people yet. So they don't even become quote-unquote persons until they find these Lord Souls. So it's like, they're just supposed to be like beasts. Now we do understand that they weren't. This doesn't mean like they were like totally like wild monsters, like say we see like the giant beast skeletons in the Tomb of the Giants, right? It's more a case that they were not quote unquote civilized as at least the Dark Souls world likes to frame it, because as we learn from Quelana, before the Age of Fire, they actually they've been wearing those clothes, like the raggedy gold hand black set, right? So it's like it's got some simple jewelry, which maybe they are, maybe not, they added later. But the idea is that generally it's this very rough, poorly made robes, and these robes, they're barefoot and all that, like very simple stuff, right? As far as clothing is concerned. And the idea is that it's supposed to help you with poisons and bleeding and all these like various things that you might find in the elements if you were living like among the crags and stuff like that. And the idea is that this is something that Quelana and her sisters and their mother have been wearing since before the Age of Fire. Now, okay, well, when did the Age of Fire begin? Well, according to the cinematic and various item descriptions, the dawn or the beginning of the Age of Fire is at the latest point. We're talking about the dragon hunts when Seath and the lords help defeat all the dragons and all that. So it's like, okay, we go from there, and then it goes as far back as we're told, as early as them finding the Lord Soul. So basically, it seems that before the Lord Souls were discovered, they were just these tribal people that were sort of like, they were in their communities, right? Very simple, very communal, not very strong, rigid hierarchies. And it's only until later that they actually start becoming quote unquote people because they're civilized. And this is something Miyazaki and From Software have played on in past games. Mm-hmm. And it's this idea that, well, okay, like an anthropologist might gasp, but the idea is that tribal people are subhuman, right? They're more animal than person, right? Because they are not civilized. They don't live in stone houses with their sophisticated speech and writing and all that stuff that we civilized folk have in our urban settings, right? They live in the trees, and they have like all these like simple and like crude clothing and stuff. And we see this, of course, played with in like Demon Souls, of course, with like the Shadow Men and the Cut Northern Limit area and stuff. Like Northern Limit's literally the idea of you have these like tribal, animal men type of idea, like owls and snakes and dogs and hyenas and things like that. And then Dark Souls 2, of course, has the Lion Clan, as we've mentioned before. Dark Souls 3 gives us the Grus, again, this sort of barbarian tribesmen and stuff like that. And like it's a common motif. And again, like I say, anthropologists might gasp, but that's sort of the trope that Miyazaki likes to play on in these games, and we see it again here.
Yes. But yeah, everything, of course, changes when they find the Lord Souls.
Right. Because what happens is, you have to, because like as the cinematic tells us, these animals were born from the dark, right? So they've been living like their tribal communal lives. They've been basically trying to, keep their head lows, because like obviously archdragons are going to be the apex predator, right? Like you just try to, you live high in the caverns in the trees where you like bury your dead and stuff like that. You live in this very dark you live in the shadows where you're not going to be spotted from it, right? And the idea is that, okay, they're sort of born out of the dark, and they've never seen fire, because the first flame, as we see, is like deep underground and things like that, away from everyone else, right? So the idea is like they've been just kind of like existing in this world that's been affected by fire, but they've never actually seen or experienced it for themselves in quite the same way. And then finally, though, they find, like as we see in the cinematic, some of these animals eventually, they're going through the caverns, and they find it. And the Japanese text clarifies for the cinematic that they didn't just find it, they were captivated, right? So the term captivated here also has this connotation of being attracted to, so like it draws you towards it, right? So this idea that as soon as they saw it, it caught their attention, and sort of like, their eyes, you can't look away from it, right? And it brings you closer. And what happens is they then, as the cinematic tells us, they found the souls of lords within the flame. Now, two things to clarify. One, souls of lords, well, first, actually, to clarify, is not within the flame, it's near the first flame. Obviously, if it was within the flame, they'd all be burnt. So,
but you're talking about the translations of the souls of lords, right?
Yes, and what we're talking about here is, okay, so it's not that the Lord Souls are supposed to be like the strongest souls in existence, right? Like they're this huge masses of disparity, and they're all near the first flame, because obviously the residue are like, when the first flame is first coming into existence, it's exploding with all this disparity, right? And obviously the largest concentrations of it, the residue, is going to be near the flame, of course. Like that's just like that's just logical. So the idea is that, okay, so they're just like going around the flame, and they find and some of them find these large masses of disparity, these souls, and they're called the souls of lords, but it's really the souls of kings. So the idea is that kingship suddenly becomes a concept when these souls are introduced, because now you have some of the medials who have all this power, this massive amount of power in the hands of one person, and this allows them to now no longer have to be, these communal tribesmen who are considered more animals than people. Now you get hierarchy, now you get civilization, right? That's the And that's sort of the idea being is that now you have someone with all the power to impose his will on the masses and be able to say, hey, if you support me, if you're like, you do what I want, I can share some of that power. And now you, like, I have a bunch of power, you have a little bit of power, and you can now impose your will on others. Right? And you kind of see how the modern souls hierarchy and economy sort of comes into it. Like, souls become the currency because everyone values souls. And you can start sort of creating a gradient now on what's the value of a soul. We get to obviously the basic 1 unit soul currency we have, but then you have these lord souls which are worth a whole bunch of those souls, right? Because they're bigger, they're powerful, they're stronger. And the same way that it affects like sort of the economic value and being traded around, you also have this hierarchical trade now going around, because now there's going to be this huge division between the haves and the have-nots. So, and Gwyn is one of these medials who gets this lord soul. He gets the biggest lord soul, and as we see, he builds a kingdom of light, right? Like the Lord of Sunlight, the sun's light, all his children have it. So we can kind of understand that, much like how the furtive pygmy finds the dark soul, Gwyn seems to find the light soul, and the same with the others. They find a soul that sort of has a certain affinity to it, of which they use in order to shape their kingdoms.
Yes, and the power of these souls, not only do these souls introduce disparity, but the souls are of disparate power. So as you said, Gwyn is, of course, he gets the strongest soul. But as we see, that, of course, isn't going to last.
And in becoming the Lord of Light, or Sunlight, right, Gwyn becomes he essentially decides his fate, right? Because each of these souls have an affinity, and some affinities are more valuable than others in the long term. As we see, as soon as the pygmy found the dark soul, the pygmy was basically set, right? Because the dark soul is lucky, right? It's inherently lucky. That's why humans are in Dark Souls 3 are said to uniquely have luck. We see this expressed in Dark Souls 1 in terms of item discovery stat. The idea that the chances of you being able to find something someone else might not is sort of inherent to your humanity status.
Yeah, it scales with held humanity. Yeah, you see this also in Dark Souls 3. You have the Hollow Stone.
Yeah, so humans are just inherently lucky as a result. And by contrast, the holder of the light soul, Gwyn, and all of his clan who share in his power and get a little bit of pieces, so they all have a little bit of sunlight in them, basically, sunlight power. All of their light affinities are unlucky, because sure, it's going to be great right now, but in the long term, eventually fire fades and only dark remains. So that's sort of the idea, is that cosmologically speaking, the dark is sort of, it doesn't feel that way because of like all the other events surrounding it, but the dark is basically on a cosmological macro scale. Ultimately, it's the lucky one. It's the one that's going to win out, because everything in the universe is arranged so that eventually the dark is going to reign supreme. It's going to be the one that's left when all the other like the light and aspects of disparity are gone, right?
If you look at it on a graph, the integer of the dark soul is always going to expand as you stretch out the graph. Humans are always going to be in a better and better position over a longer and longer time span.
Yeah, and again, once the Age of Dark hits, then humans, like, again, is their age then, and it's an age eternal, right? So, so that's a huge part of it.
But before that happens, of course, Gwyn establishes hierarchy. He gets the economy going. He creates the civilization with the souls.
Yeah, things are good. Yeah,
things are pretty good. Things are pretty good, and things are good for Gwyn too. He finds a wife. He had some kids. Do you want to talk about his family life a little?
Oh yeah, that's very important, right? This is where we start seeing like Gwyn gets a queen, right? Like, the king wants a queen, so he gets to have someone else, and they start having children. And in Dark Souls 1, we're established that he has a firstborn son, and then he has Guinevere, his eldest daughter, and then Dark Souls 3, of course, reveals that he has a younger daughter, Filianor. So, like, you can start seeing, well, like, clearly the marriage is going good. So, like, he's having these, and he's having them, of course, relatively early on, because as we know, of course, Firstborn's got to be involved in the dragon hunts, and Filianor, obviously, in Dark Souls 3 establishes she's got to go to the pygmy, so, like, obviously there's a lot of things. And that's something too important. The cinematic is condensing, like, an entire history from, like, the Big Bang to, like, medieval times in our world. And, like, imagine that being condensed into, like, a 3-minute, like, summary, right? That's what's happening, essentially, in the Dark Souls universe. So we're talking about, like, tons of events, and we're, like, still in, like, the first minute of the cinematic, right? So, like...
Yeah. There's a ton of just history that is sort of missing from this world that you really need to start, digging behind the pavement to find what was going on there.
Well, yeah, like, it's there, but again, it's one of those things where it's like a lot of necessary events are happening or are expressed to happen in the text, in the world, and things like that aren't going to tell you in the cinematic. And the cinematic can, because of how it's condensing so much stuff, it can sort of pervert your ideas of, like, how this world is sort of came to be. Like, it's like, like the idea is like, oh, fire came to be, and then all these things were around there, and they found the fire. Like, again, we're talking about like tons of time. What we just explained, tons of time is obviously happening between this stuff. It isn't like, it all happens in an instant.
Yeah. We should note that Gwyndolin comes to being after the Dragon Wars, and there's a very special reason for that.
Yeah, like, Gwyndolin is much later, and he's Gwyn's last child, his youngest child, so...
Yes. But, after, he's established civilization, one of the first crafts they really dive into is firesmithing. Now, the soul is disparity, and the fire is the mechanism by which you can sort of change. You can take metal and you can remold it. You can give it new shape. That's the basic concept, right? Like, you heat up, you use the heat of fire in order to make that metal, and metal's a mineral, much like rock, right? So, like, the idea of you have fire, and it helps sort of change and bend, manipulates a mineral element for your purposes, right? And fire is obviously the most basic thing for smithing, but as we eventually see, it's not just you bending the metal itself, it's you actually infusing the power of fire within that mineral element itself, and so then we get fire weapons and things like that. Yes, you get the enchantments. But we also note that there is a time scale on this, where you have like brass, copper weapons first, then you move on into like steel and silver later.
Yeah, well, maybe not silver, but definitely, like, what we see is, like, again, we see a similar progression where, like, it starts out in a Stone Age, right? Like, we see this the earliest period, the gods are making their coffins out of just simple basic stone, right? Like, you have this idea, like, okay, so things are very analogous to, like, our own societal and historical development, right? Like, it's okay, we were quote-unquote animals when we were just, like, simple tribes folk, like, living the simple lives in the shadows of these bigger, scarier predators and things like that. But now we have the power and the intellect to establish these rigid hierarchies and organize societies in ways that we can now do more complicated things that we could never do before when we were just like a bunch of community people sitting around the campfire, right?
Yes.
Well, no campfire, but you get my drift. The point is that now that they've discovered the fire and the power of the Lord Soul, the power of the Lord Souls, the Medial specifically, this is Gwyn's clan. We're not talking about Izalith and Nito. Obviously, they seem to be Medials themselves, but they're part of, like, they're going off doing their own thing, establishing their own kingdoms, essentially, right?
Yeah, it seems like there's, if there's not a rift, then maybe they were Medials, but not necessarily the same. Yes,
different tribes,
tribe.
maybe, or maybe they broke off from the tribe at some point. Because obviously, both Nito and Izalith established themselves as very independent characters in terms of what they want and what they do. So you can easily see them having already sort of been acting separately or broken off as soon as they found their individual soul of power, right?
Yes.
And they weren't interested in sort of establishing hegemony over the clan the same way Gwyn does, right? And as a result, sort of like the medials that we see and in Gwyn's tribe that establish Anor Londo, they're the ones who are like going through this Stone Age and development in a very different way than, say, necessarily Izalith or Nito do. And the one part of that is, of course, they develop smithing, which again, you can imagine that's just so fundamental to the society in a world where fire is such a important part of that. And one of the first things we know is that it has to be firesmithing, because again, firesmithing has this special, unique, old methods of development, which most modern people don't know, right? Like, we have to go to Vamos, who's the only guy who knows these old methods of how to work with fire. And you show any other Emperor to Vamos, and he's like, I don't want to work with that stuff. Like, he's only interested in fire weapons. He's only interested in the old stuff. And he's like, embers nowadays, like, they're not really, they don't make them like they used to, right? Like, he's one of those old codger type of characters. Right. And as we see, eventually the gods move on from this, but Izalith obviously sticks to the fire and obviously goes into chaos smithing and things like that. But generally speaking, the idea is that, okay, the Medials as a whole had to basically have started on this as a civilizational downturn. And eventually they move on to, as we see, more important stuff. But first, they gotta, if they want to build their civilization, they need people to build it.
Yes, and this is one of those things which, when I first learned about this seemed to me like a really weird thing, but actually this is one of those things that, like I said earlier, you just need to dig a bit under the pavement and you see this is clearly there. And this is, of course, the enslaving of the giants. Right,
well, they're giant slaves, so of course they have to be enslaved, right?
Yes.
And the idea is like, okay, so you have these medials who are related to giants, but they're very distinct, clearly, both physiologically and just in terms of just how where their societies are at, right? And now you have this case where, okay, well, they're like now, like Gwyn's established himself as a king. He's now in charge. He's created this hierarchy. He's created this developed civilization right now, and he's like they're building up, and they're studying this power of the light soul and how to use it and how to create these things, and they can now like make like they're starting to like forge weapons and things like that. There's a huge disparity of power now between, say, the lords and those who still haven't gotten to that level of development, like the giants. The giants were presumably still communal. So it's like, okay, well, there's huge disparity. Well, what's going to stop then the medials from coming in and saying, okay, we'll just conquer you and enslave you, right? Like it's very obvious how we get from the medials discovering their power to now having giant slaves, right? It's war is the best way for you to go find and get them, right? You beat them into submission, and now it's okay. You do what we say.
Yes, and we have that giant grave outside of Undeadburg, connecting him to the construction of that. You have
right. What we see is that's a great example, right? Because like you have this graveyard and you see all these different cultures for humans and stuff, and they're clearly human graves, right? So you have like I think there's some like Indian style graves, some Japanese style graves, some obviously just generic Western style like headstones and things like that. And then you get these giant headstones that have giant skeletons that are spawned in front of it, right? So it's very clear that like we have some giants that were dying and doing so. Well, it's like, okay, well, these are supposed to be giant slaves in Sen's Fortress and Anor Londo. So what are they doing here? Well, obviously, if you're slaves, they're gonna, and you see this giant undead burg, which has, like, as we see, the undead burg is this massive complex. Like, you're gonna need a lot of big, strong workers to be able to do this, and giant slaves are ideal, right? So, like, you have, like, Anor Londo is basically sending its slaves to do that. Some of them die during construction, and then, of course, they're gonna bury them here where all the humans are, because why not?
Yes. So they build the kiln, they build Anor Londo, they build the Gods Archives, they use the slave labor from, the giant slave labor to do that. But then they uplift the good slaves to higher status beneath the gods.
Right? Yeah. So we see that again. Like, you see, again, the Stone Age stuff, like the kiln and things like that. And obviously, Anor Londo eventually has to get built up and things like that. Like, you do all this with the giants, right? And we see in concept art how the giants are sort of involved as far as the kiln is concerned and things like that. But then, like, okay, well, if you're a good slave, right, if you distinguish yourself in some ways, then your master might be like, you know what, I'm gonna throw you a bone, right? It's suddenly, like, some of these slaves become giant guards that, like, guard around Anor Londo. And the especially special slaves, they're the ones who get to become royal guards, right? They're the giant sentinels we see inside the thing. They get the fancy armor and the sort of the nice cloaks and things like that. It's like, you get the special honor of defending the king and the royalty and all that. So you get now, like, don't you feel honored, right? And as Dark Souls 3 adds, we also have like giant adjudicators, right? So now they're like judges, and they're sort of basically they're like they're sort of like the point men for the medials, and that, like, sort of like if the king said, like, if the king makes a decree, the judge goes in there and makes sure that the decree is done, is basically okay, this is following the rule, this is not following the rule, right? So, like, you can kind of see it's like, okay, so, or like, again, Hawkeye Goff is a great example of this. He distinguishes himself, and Gwyn's like, okay, I'll make you a knight, right? So you get this idea where they're never going to they don't ever become gods, right? Like, they're never going to be on the same level, right? But the idea is like, okay, we have now gods coming into existence, right? We have this idea that we are special in this way, and that you have to not just bow and serve us, you have to worship us, you have to venerate us. Aren't we so good to you that we let you have this status, that we, we stay the whip when you behave properly and do what we want? So, this idea of sort of religiosity to the medials gets added on now, and we start seeing sort of the religion aspect develop.
And yes, we see with this elevation of status with the giants, the Chloranthy ring is of course on the tombs themselves that we can find in the Tomb of the Giants, and the Chloranthy ring is of course connected to the gods.
Yeah, you established this very well in your video, right? You talked about how it's obviously in the Great Hollow, right? So it's close to the lower world and stuff, where obviously the gods once were, when they were just playing regular old medials, like just sort of living out their days down there. And then now, as we see, it's also sort of the same pedal status and things like that. The numbers and all that is now inside the god's slaves, right? And the idea with the Chloranthy ring is, of course, it's this green blossoming flower. Now, blossoming flower is a common symbol you see throughout Anor Londo architecture and styles and things like that. This idea of fire and the sun is represented as this just sort of this flower and bloom. And in terms of the Chloranthy ring, even though it doesn't have like the same, like usually we see the power of sunlight and the fire and all that represents like healing and things like that, you still have this idea of sort of energizing and enlivening yourself through the power of stamina and like endurance and things like that. So like your stamina recovery goes up. And like we see examples of this, like say Fina. Like Fina has this ability where she can increase your endurance and things like that, though her reason for doing that is probably very different. But again, same idea of the god's power being able to use in that, and obviously in Dark Souls 3 Ring City, we see how Gwyn is holding a Chloranthy ring in his hand. So we can this idea of like the Chloranthy is supposed to be this old ring of unknown origin, but it's very clearly it was something that is a very early symbol. The ring's just an example of some of the early symbols that Anor Londo established as Gwyn's kingdom was being built up and how he was interacting with other races. And in terms of the slaves, it's like, hey, we're your gods. This is the power that we do so. So we're gonna just plant this symbol even when you're dead and buried. Yeah,
and as they develop their civilization, we eventually move on from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age, and we develop. Enchanted smithing becomes more central to the way they conduct warfare. With both lightning
they're moving on
and,
from fire now. They're moving on from fire. Now they got to make wooden mallets in order to work it. But they figure out basically, okay, now we can not just use like the power of flame. We can use the power of sunlight itself that we're giving. Like we're sharing all this power of sunlight and things. Now we can like infuse that sunlight into it, and like eventually that develops into like the holy magic we see, which seems to be some derivative of that. And it's like, okay, so we're starting to like get more advanced, quote unquote, advanced forms of smithing. Vamos would disagree, of course, but same basic idea, right? And they're starting to like again, this shows how they're starting to study their power deeply. They're creating these, so they start making these very impressive technological marvels, like the corkscrew elevator lifts that they do, or like the lift that they create when you're going to the Anor Londo Cathedral and things like that. Like you're starting to, or again, the Duke's Archives. You see that what looks like to have been like this giant lift device that would have raised the level so you can get to different parts of the archive tower. That
you're talking about the prison area.
Yeah, that area.
Yeah,
obviously, now it's got a prison, it's got a staircase and stuff, but that was all very recent because of Seath and stuff like that, right? Before it was a prison, it's clear that was just a proper library, right? And the device at the bottom, it's only in ruins now, but it's clear it would have been a ruins that would have lifted up the like basically this giant like floor tablet, and you could basically like get to different levels of the building in order to pick out your books, right? So stuff like that. Another part of this, of course, is the gargoyles, right? Like, you start seeing, like, golem craft become a thing, right? Like, this, obviously, Dark Souls 2 goes all the way with it, but the idea with Dark Souls 1 is that we see how the gods start creating golems. You take these stone statues, you put souls in them, and they start becoming their own living things now, and these creatures of stone, and they're very similar to dragons, right? Which is very relevant for later, but the idea is like, you know, they can even breathe fire like dragons, and obviously more advanced versions can breathe lightning, and obviously that becomes important for some of their later developments as well. But again, we see these really impressive things that they're really trying to understand both the world around them, but the power that Gwyn has gotten a hold of.
Yeah. That's another one of those things that FromSoft likes to go back to from time to time, is this idea of golems and the importation of will onto inanimate objects, but let's not dilly-dally too long on that one. They create deep studies, they create all these technological marvel, and they use gold, silver, and copper as the most conductive metals.
Yeah. So, like, generally speaking, when we're seeing what the gods create, they generally use stuff derived from copper, so like bronze and brass. Now, obviously, though, they have lower conductive points than base copper, but the idea seems to generally be you take copper, you infuse some lightning power into it, because again, electricity easily conducts through copper, silver, and gold, and then you turn it into like the different alloys that we see. And then obviously silver, we see the Silver Knights, gold, we see Ornstein, right? So it's the idea of like this stuff you can infuse lightning and holy power easier than other metals, and that seems to be why they go through a Bronze Age, not just the fact that obviously you need to kind of develop your smithing in order to get to the level of developing iron and steel and things like that, right? So
yeah, but they eventually manage that, and we get the
they do,
we get the Iron Age, so to speak. It's some difficulties.
Yeah, there's a bit of problem. So, like, it's referred to in the localization as both white iron and marcasite being an actual metal, but it's important to understand the metal marcasite literally in Japanese is white iron. So the idea, and this we see this similarly with other stuff, right? Like, for example, I forget the exact term, but Brightstone in Dark Souls 2 is the same as those special stones that you get in Demon Souls that let you like light up your surroundings and stuff, or they have the prism stone effect where there's like the different lights that can help you guide your way, right? Those are literally called Brightstones, but it's an actual mineral. And in Elden Ring they call them glint stones, but again, same idea, right? It's the idea that you'll see a lot of times Miyazaki will take actual real terminology, but he'll play on their actual literal meaning rather than their colloquial meaning that you see sort of in our world, right? So the idea is that when the gods have created this white iron that has this special, we see has this lightning and holy defense and all this stuff. And it seems like this white iron took a little bit of trial and error, because we see like Leroy wields this sacred treasure, like this wonderful holy relic, Grant. But Grant, it looks to just be this misshapen mass of white iron welded to a fancy pommel, right? So it's like, oh, well, it looks like we messed up with this. And it has power. It has this Wrath of the Gods effect, right? But it's like, it's clearly all melted, and this didn't really work out the way we were hoping. Well, we don't all, waste not, want not, right? So we'll just, we'll stick it on this fancy pommel and we'll turn into this hammer.
Yeah, precisely. Right?
Yeah, and then, like, again, this leads to the development of, like, iron and things like that happen in... We don't see this as much, again, associated with holiness, of course, but it does show that, again, they're developing these things. They need for example, the Silver Knights, when they're shooting their arrows out of their great arrows, out of their great bows during the dragon hunts, they're using iron spears, basically.
We should maybe talk a bit about the Silver Knights training in Sen's Fortress, because Sen's Fortress didn't used to be just weird... tricks and traps.
Sen's Fun House of Traps, you mean?
Yeah. No, this is a dragon hunting training place, as is made clear by the concept art.
Yeah. So, like, I didn't actually look at the concept art till after the fact, so I ended up figuring this out all on my own. Like, as soon as you look at the Iron Golem's boss arena, you see, like, it's like got this, it's basically a straight hall straight to this back area that's all bricked up now, but it would have been some entrance that led into Anor Londo, right?
Yes.
And the idea is that, okay, well, there's this platform here, and if you look at the actual, like, larger platform, it's got these two remnants of walls here. So the idea is that anyone could have passed through straight to get to the hallways, but they would have passed between these two walls. Now, why do they have those walls there randomly in the middle? Well, that's because, as we see, there's these different towers, and these towers have these gargoyles attached to them, but the gargoyles have two things. One, they kind of look like dragons, much like the gargoyles that we see that the gods are already creating. But these gargoyles, which aren't animate or anything, they have these little spouts in their open mouths, so it looks like something would shoot out of them, right? And it's like, okay, so you have dragons that would shoot anything. Well, obviously they'd shoot out fire, right? And concept art, that's what concept art confirms, is that the fire would have started, like, building up into the tower and shot out of their mouths over there. So the walls are there to protect anyone who's trying to pass through in case, like, they get to the walls and stuff. But it becomes very obvious that the idea is like, well, why are you doing this? Well, to train, of course. You get, like, a bunch of Silver Knight trainees or squires or something. You get them in front of the wall, and they have their shields and stuff, and, like, the fire comes out, they raise their shield, and they learn some endurance training, because Gwyn wants to hunt dragons, so they've got to really learn how to endure those flames when they start shooting them at them, right? And same thing with, like, the various, like, statues we see. We see so many statues in Sen's Fortress, all these Silver Knight statues here. It becomes very clear, like, some of them might be used for training dummies or something like that. So, like, it's like, okay, well, just bang your sword against this thing a few times, right? And then when the area no longer is used for training, they just, like, stuff all the statues to the side, and obviously the fire, like, the fire training spot has become basically unused. It's fallen to ruin and all that stuff because no one's using it, right? And now they just, like, they put the Iron Golem there. So, like, very clearly you can see there's a history to Sen's Fortress going back all the way to the dragon hunts, before the dragon hunts even.
Yeah, and again, if you just look at the opening cinematic and you take it on its face that this is just happening, if you don't add, like, hundreds of years of history in between all of these different frames, it looks like Gwyn just has all his knights and then he fights the dragons. But no, like, Anor Londo exists before he fights the dragons. Like, history has already happened, and you have these civilizations springing up in the world that have been very firmly established before all of that.
Yeah, like, the Regal Archives are the God's library. It's where they have all this knowledge that they've been collecting for clearly much longer and much older than when Seath takes over, right after the dragon hunts, right? Where Seath starts, like, sort of taking over and making it, like, his personal castle. You have all this history that has to go into, just going by the cinematic, Gwyn's crown. his clothes, the Silver Knights and their armors and weapons. There has to be so much preparation that goes into this. That's more than just what the cinematic can show, even. So again, the series just kind of goes all like, okay, there was rock, and then there was fire came out, and then people found Lord Souls near the flame, and then suddenly you have these different lords that are existing, and then they go and fight the dragons, right? They like Miyazaki's got to kind of like condense this history reel doing so. But if you go through the game, you can see both in the text and in the environment, and again, just understanding like some basic psychology of how people think and work and develop as cultures and civilizations, both a macro and micro level, that all these events clearly must happen, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing.
So prior to actually fighting the dragons, prior to Gwyn allying with the lords, is this where the primordial serpents become relevant?
Yeah. So primordial serpents seem to be the party that most likely were in part lobbying. Now, obviously, there's a lot of benefits to hunting down the dragons regardless. But we do see the primordial serpents, Koth, Frampt, and others are sort of, they have a very specific outlook that they're going through. And the dragon hunts play into that in a very unique way. So Koth and Frampt describe themselves as not primordial serpents, but as world serpents, right? It plays on the idea of the Jormungand, right? So, like, the world serpent that, like, loops around the world, he bites his own tail, ties into Ouroboros and all that stuff. There's a lot of symbolism there. But as far as we're concerned, the idea is that the serpents think of themselves as, they're sort of like, they're cosmopolitan, right? Like, they're not just, like, they're not just any side or country or community, right? They're thinking about the world. Like, that's their ideas. They're, as Koth describes himself in the Japanese script, he's the one who tries to guide things to the proper age, right? So the idea is that, okay, the world is going in a certain direction. As Koth says, fire fades, dark remains. Eventually that's going to happen. Well, before the dark ending up being the only thing left, fire first has to flare up, right? Because before it can fade, it has to rise. So you kind of have this idea that Koth and the world serpents weren't always like sort of like this thing like age of dark, age of dark, age of dark. The idea is like they just want to follow wherever the world's going. At one point, the world was going up, up, up with the light flame, like stocks up. And the idea with the dragon hunts is that, okay, well, the dragon hunts firmly established that the medials, the gods, are now in charge. The lords have taken all the power of light and life and death and all that, and they have now triumphed over the old, like, the dragons who represent, like, the old age, right? So you can kind of see how the serpents are sort of lobbying behind this. And we know that the serpents were extremely close. Obviously, Frampt considers himself a close friend of Gwyn. You also see Koth speaks, and he has this intimate knowledge about what Gwyn's thinking is during like when the fire's fading and things like that. These are not serpents who are like just outsiders, right?
We we see statues of one of the serpents at least in the Ringed City.
Yeah, like, and it's probably just supposed to be a generic serpent,
Yeah.
but the idea is that, they eventually become closely aligned with the humans, but Ring City is obviously, just architecturally speaking, an Anor Londo built city. Obviously, the idea is that Gwyn gave them to the pygmies, but the idea is that clearly the primordial serpents, they don't become associated with the dark, seemingly, until, obviously, once the gods have already established themselves. And even then, it's not like they're, like, lobbying and subterfuge and all this stuff. It's basically not until the fire begins actually fading that we see, like, actual conflict between the serpents, where like Koth and his ilk are like, you gotta kind of let the age play out, and Frampt's like, no, I think Gwyn's got a point here.
yeah, and before Gwyn goes to fight the dragons, he of course has to ally with the other lords, and I think we should talk a bit about the Dark Soul in this, because when you see the cinematic, when you'll see that the witches burned down the homes of the dragons, Gwyn ripped their scales off. And,
well, he didn't rip them off; he pierced them with the lightning.
Yeah, but yes. And he exposed their flesh so that Nidho could release the miasma of death. But you notice that like humanity's role in this war is kind of missing.
Yeah. Well, the point of the furtive pygmy, the Japanese on the unfortunately now defunct website, is that it's the pygmy of the shadows that no one knows about, right? The idea is that they've been scrubbed from history. And obviously Dark Souls 3 Ring City sort of elaborates on this, on like the Ring Knights were sort of involved in the Dragon Hunts, like they were the principal party there, but no one sings praises of them, right? So it's the idea is that the gods are clearly there's some difference in the alliances. Now, obviously the idea is, okay, well, why doesn't Gwyn just conquer the lords like he did the giants? Well, one, there's a power difference, right? So Gwyn is supposed to have the largest, most powerful soul, right? But that doesn't necessarily, but the difference in power isn't as much when you have other lord souls in the picture, right? So now this is idea of, okay, well, Gwyn probably would win, but, like, what's going to be the cost? How many are going to die? What's that going to do to his civilization? And it's quite possible maybe he does lose, right? Like, you can't, like, rule out that chance just because he has all the advantages. So it's like, there's a lot less incentive now to just kind of go in and try to roll over and conquer and enslave, right? There's this idea, and obviously the idea is like, okay, well, I could do all these things, and I might turn out on top, but then I'm, like, hurting my own kingdom in the process, and I've got this big picture plan to go after the dragons. So Gwyn, and this is where we see, like, Gwyn throughout all of this has shown sort of masterful politicking, right? In order to establish like, Gwyn, for being the guy, as we said earlier, is unlucky, Gwyn sort of builds all these successes. These are all his, right? This isn't like the universe and fate are playing with doing so. This is all Gwyn. Everything is his decision, how he's doing it, and he does it pretty intelligently, right? Like, you can respect him for being a very clever character. He's like, okay, I'm going to just make alliances with you, right? Like, I'm just going to be like, okay, we can all be in this together.
Yeah, and it's really convenient for Gwyn that the Witch of Izalith and Nito, they don't really seem to have conquering ambitions, at least not yet. And whereas like the furtive pygmy, of course, sort of disappears from the history books. Gwyn, on the other hand, as the most powerful, he seems to just have this endless ambition.
Yeah, he's arrogant, right? He's someone who had nothing, and then he got the power to be the top of everything, right? He could now go from literally the base of the mountain to the tallest peak. Like,
yes.
that, and obviously, him and the Medials, by extension, call themselves gods. Like, there's this inherent arrogance, and obviously Dark Souls 2 Shoutcores sort of highlights this, right? Like, the idea he's the vainglorious liar, right? So this idea that Gwyn is just this arrogant, vain, self-serving, selfish person. And again, like I say, this is something that becomes more and more clear. He will enslave you, and then he will then try to give you, but then he'll like go from the stick to the carrot, and he'll be like, okay, I'll give you the status and nice things to do so. And we see the same with the lords. He can't do the enslaving part, so he's like, okay, well, what if I talk to them and we sort of work out a deal, and then like I get what I want and you get what you want, because you're not interested in like this sort of conquering and being the person on top, right? Like Nito, he's interested in death, right? So it's like, okay, well, Nito, you can have absolute domain over death, just don't bring the death to, my domain and my people, but when they do die, we'll give them to you, because that'll be what you control. See, that's a fair compromise, right? Okay, you go, okay, and now Witch of Izalith, okay, well, Izalith, hear me out here. Like, you're doing this experimentation, you're really obsessed with understanding life and fire and its power to be able to create life and mold life and all this stuff. So, like, we want to kind of go against these dragons, so maybe you want some, like, like research specimens and things like that, and, that can help with you, right? Like, you can do, so, like, the idea is that all these lords are getting something out of this deal, both for their own personal projects, and those don't, and none of the individual lords' personal ambitions overlap in a way that forces them to be in conflict. So why bring them to conflict? So, like, everyone could just work together and things will be good. And Gwyn may be the dominant party, right? Like, he's going to throw his weight around and have the most because he's the most powerful soul and all this, right? Like, he's obviously going to kind of be the guy who's like, I'm in charge, right? Like, we see this in Anor Londo's cathedral, right? Like, you have the statues of Guinevere and presumably where his firstborn would have been before he got kind of, like, wiped off the history record. But then you have Gwyn in the center, and he's the bigger statue, right? He's got to be front and center. He's got to be the larger than like he's always got to be the central focus. He's the king. He's the big guy.
Yes. And notably here with the talk of politicking is Gwyn's treatment of humanity.
Yes, because the pygmy is according to Koth, is the one who finds the Lord Soul after all the others, right? And the pygmy finds the Dark Soul, right? And we'll just assume the pygmy's a he just for the sake of simplicity here. So Pygmy Lord, he finds this Lord Soul, and now he does it, and he spreads it among humanity, right? Miyazaki confirms this in outside interview, so like there's real, again, it's obvious in game, but just in case for those who want to know. So it's absolutely confirmed that the Pygmy, when Koth says how he's the ancestor to our kind, he doesn't mean literal ancestor like he gave birth to all humans. Obviously, if there's a Pygmy, there's probably a Pygmy ancestor and a Pygmy Lord, right? So like Gwyn is born in Lordran, and he has Lloyd, who is his uncle, and obviously the idea is that Lloyd must have a brother who is Gwyn's father, right? So the idea is like Gwyn didn't just sort of come out of the ether. All of them have a family history and lineage, and probably the same with the Pygmies. And then Dark Soul with the Pygmy Lord, and obviously Dark Souls 3: Ring City confirms this by introducing us to just the Pygmy race as a whole, right? So it's already implicit in the original game. And the idea is that when Koth is referring to him as the ancestor of mankind, he means a sort of spiritual ancestor, and that the Pygmy sort of divides up his Lord Soul, and each little shard becomes the humanity that we all possess within each of us, right? It's it's this little fragment of the dark soul that we all have, right? And his, obviously, as a Lord Soul, his Lord Soul looks like a regular flame, but it's really, really tiny, right? That's sort of the dark affinity at play here compared to the other Lord Souls, which obviously also have their little quirks and qualities, right? But they generally just look like big flames. And we obviously see this in the in-game graphics and stuff like that. But the point with the pygmy is that, okay, he takes this tiny little flame and then it becomes the various little black humanities sprites that we see. And and this all gets done, and then Gwyn discovers, and it comes on Gwyn's radar somehow, right? And like, well, this is now sort of a problem for Gwyn in two respects. One is like, okay, well, so you have this power of the dark soul, right? And it's already been spread among your kind, so it's not like I can just stuff you and take the power or get rid of it or something like that, right? Like that, like it's already too late for that. But at the same time, though, he doesn't just so he can't really get rid of them necessarily. At the same time, though, as we can see, that the gods clearly have the upper hand throughout this entire ordeal. They're the ones who ultimately scrub the pygmy out of history. So it's like, okay, so it looks like we're in a situation where the pygmies haven't developed as a civilization, and Dark Souls 3 Ring City makes this confirmed, right? Like, Gwyn basically comes up and says, okay, I'm going to build up your kingdom here. Have an entire city to build your country, right? Around, yes. Right?
Again, carrot and stick.
Yeah, carrot and stick, right? It's like, I don't, we don't, it's like, I don't want to fight you because you have power that I'm afraid of. Koth makes that clear. Gwyn fears the dark because obviously the general maxim that Koth gets across is, fire fades and dark remains. So like this idea that the dark dark and light are basically constantly opposed, and there's this natural antagonism. So Gwyn doesn't want that, but he wants to work with them and have all four lords involved in the dragon hunt. So again, similar idea. You want to build up your civilization? I'll help you with that. And then you can help me with the dragon hunts and things like that, and everything's doing so. Now, as Koth lays out, the Pygmy Lord's got this little plan in the back of his mind where it's like, I have the dark soul, right? So eventually, this whole fire fades, dark remains thing is going to happen. So like, in the end, I'm going to be the one on top here. So it's like, okay, I'll just lay low, like kind of go along with things, bide my time, and eventually I'll be the one having the last laugh, right? Like, or at least his descendants will, right? So there's this.
Do you think you don't think he had like that sort of malice? Wasn't he just sort of acting on the will of the soul? Or well, not on the will of the soul, just more like, I don't have necessarily ambitions for conquest. I just think it's the right thing to do to share this among the people.
Well, you can argue about how far the pygmy would do. Obviously, the dark soul is sort of established as a soul that is naturally it's greedy. It wants more things. It wants to take. It wants to do stuff. Yeah. So while we see the lords and the Gwyns, obviously it's not exclusive to humans. Medials clearly show plenty of greed. Obviously, Gwyn brands an entire clan, brands parts of his own clansmen for such greed. There's definitely this idea of. That the dark is just inherently just this thing that wants more and takes and wants more and takes and takes and takes and takes and takes. So, again, you can argue how malicious that the pygmy is in all this, but there's no denying that, like, he's obviously like sort of playing along and he's plotting stuff long term so that where he comes out on top in the end, right?
All right. And we talked carrot and stick. This is where we get into Gwyn sort of inserting himself more and more into the lives of humanity, where you get, if you ally yourself with Gwyn, you get these miracles. You get enchanted materials like rings that, these are good things for you. They heal you. They give you more vigor. Vigority.
Vigority. No, but yeah, that's true. Like the idea with the idea with the gods and the pygmies, right, is that Gwyn sort of helps build up their kingdom, and then humans spread out, though, right? It's like, okay, well, why does Gwyn want them to spread out? Well, one, because he's already, as Koth describes, put shackles on the gods, and obviously the implication, of course, is that is the ring of fire to the dark side and things like that, and later games sort of, like Dark Souls 2 obviously builds upon this idea to make it more obvious, and Dark Souls 3 just flat out goes and say, oh yeah, the gods, they put a ring of fire that sealed the dark and all that stuff on the pygmies, right? So the idea is that, okay, so like Gwyn has all the pygmies in one place, and then he puts this seal of fire on them, right? This ring of fire that's going to seal the dark of their dark soul, right? Because Gwyn is scared, right? Because we see all the races in this universe have a huge lifespan. Like, Gwyn is an old man when he's going into the dragon hunts. He's basically been an old man up until he dies, when the fire fades. So it's like you have the dragon hunts, you have this giant golden age, and then like when things are going bad and you finally sacrifice, you're still alive and kicking. Obviously, Lloyd, who's even older than Gwyn as his uncle, is still alive and kicking. So like like the time scale of the lifespans of all these living things is enormous. Like wolves, Sif's been around for like hundreds of years. Cats, they've been around for forever, right? Like all this stuff is like every form of life seems to live in the terms of hundreds, if not thousands of years. Except humans. Humans seem to have the normal, like, you know, I'm lucky if I live till like 80, right? So it's like, they have very short, well, that's kind of weird. Well, as we see, with the power of the Dark Soul, they could be live for eternity. They have immortality. They could easily outlive the gods in the end, because no matter how long your life is, eventually, it's not eternity. You're gonna die, and then your son will die, and then your son's son will die, and that's obviously something that's very scary for Gwyn. So what he does with this, placing this seal of fire on them, he's not just sealing the power of the dark, he's sealing the immortality that comes with it, right? So now that they're not just mortal, they have very, very small lifespans compared to the rest of the races, and they're barely able to eke out make a living, eke out existence, you know, have a few kids and then die,
of
right?
course, when you have 10,000 years and they have 100 years max, that of course makes it very easy for you to gradually sort of insert yourself more and more into their lives.
Right? So like once the pygmies become pygmies get shackled, and again, the difference between the pygmies and humans basically seems to be more time than anything, right? Like we see some physical differences in their face. They have like flatter ape-like noses, but basically the idea is this is where we get the modern humans as we know them, right? Like they're shackled, some generations pass, and they basically start looking like the medials, right? Like they have this like lively skin.
Is that because they've grown this affinity for fire?
In some respects, yes, because the Ring of Fire is sealing the dark, it's separating them, and now the soul they're building up is like everyone else. Like it's this normal, like, white soul, right, that we collect off of corpses and things like that. And humans eventually don't even know what humanity really is. It's just this thing that all humans have, right? And they don't realize that's their original dark soul that's been sealed away, right? And the idea is that, okay, Gwyn lets the pygmies spread out now. It's like, okay, they have this kingdom, but now they can spread out across the world. And as we know, humans go far and wide. They're like everywhere, right? Like no other race we see goes everywhere like this. And the reason obviously being is that because, well, humans, once they've spread out, we see how they change, right? Like you look at places like Xena and Baldur, they're these old kingdoms, but they don't got any dark heritage really to speak of. They have some like traces of it, like Xena, their faces still have this like old haggard look, somewhat like the pygmies that we see with the hollow form and things like that. The Baldur has like this idea of like physical, thick plated armor, sort of this idea with like the dark is physical in Dark Souls 1 and very much so it's like this physical element there. So you see like some like very faint, like vague traces, but generally speaking, most of these countries, and obviously definitely not the newer countries, they don't have these traits in cultural memory about the dark. They spread out, they go far, things happen, people live and die, generations change, and history sort of gets forgotten. At the same time, you have the gods here, and they're like, listen, you can't really use that dark power as much because we kind of sealed it for you, but you're living in the Five Fingers River Basin, and it's like you're just trying to be a peasant farmer. Like, if you had some of that power of sunlight that we have, this holy power of ours, we could like help your crops grow better, make sure that everything lives, and you're gonna have a good harvest so you don't starve. Worship us a little, give a little like offering and like prayer to the gods, right? And slowly you can kind of see how over the generations the humans become more reliant on the gods. They become more dependent upon them, and they start really loving the gods and their power and their fire. It's like, it's great, right? Like we live great, and like we've never known a life other than this now, right? And like it's only like as Dark Souls 3 Ring City establishes, there's only the Ring City which really kind of preserves it in cultural memory. And like places like Ulasil, for example, they have some memory, but not all of it. And the idea is that, okay, they forget their heritage, they become reliant on the gods and their holy magic, their miracles and all that, because, they heal injuries, they help the crops grow, like they help us find our way back home, all that stuff. And then eventually, as we see, this creates this wonderful, vibrant trade with the gods, where it's like, okay, humans are coming to Anor Londo, right? Like there's an ancient human who made a request to have these special lightning crossbow bolts, right? Because crossbows are this unique, like obviously the gods are still using bows and humans invent crossbows because, human ingenuity and all that. And the idea is that, the giant blacksmith is continuing to make those bolts because of that request. And that's from a very long time ago. So humans have been coming here. Obviously, we see with Sen's Fortress, there's this idea of it kind of being like a border outpost where it's like, okay, it's like border control, right? Like, it's like, okay, you can come in, you can immigrate in, you can come out, right? You leave these pots here with different like materials and stuff like that at the entrance or whatever. And we like make sure that we check them and stuff. And then you can move right along into Anor Londo. And then some of them become like priests and things like that. And like all of that sort of works itself out.
Yeah, and so while they're covertly sort of inserting themselves into their lives, there is also this that's very, I'd say covertly, that's kind of overt. They're very they present themselves as these magnanimous gift givers, but under the hood, the dark is being suppressed.
Right, like so, like we see this with Oswald, for example, right? Like Oswald, if you're not quote unquote religious, if you're not part of covenants, right? Because covenants is this big idea where you make agreement, and most of the covenants deal with making deals with gods, right? And the idea is like, you become part of my cult, and then you serve me or whatever. And Oswald's like, well, if you're not religious, that's fine. The gods are magnanimous, right? Like the gods don't care as long as you're not like actively opposing them. Like you could be indifferent to the gods, it's fine. We got 80% of humans who love us, right?
Yeah, you don't need to control all
out.
of them. That's like, you have to use too much force maybe to do that, but you can get most of them.
Right, and that's the idea. You don't have to enslave them like you did with the giants, but you can use your leverage, use your power, use your control, use the fact that you're the one building it, and we can see how it's the systematic oppression without humans even necessarily realizing it.
Yeah, and it's probably pretty adaptive, because the societies, they fragment and they develop independently of one another. So you can in a farm country, you can present yourself as a god of harvest, and you can help with the harvest. Whereas in maybe a more ocean-faring country, you can be the god of vigor, so to help them swim or whatever.
Right, like, because again, godhood is a status. So like the idea is that when these gods are like gods of something, it's really just like a fancy way of saying they have a job description or a personality, a trait, right? Yeah, like, it's like Guinevere. Guinevere's loved by everyone because she's a goddess of good harvest. When it says like bounty and fertility, they mean harvest, a goddess, essentially.
It's a job description, but it's also a description that you serve Gwyn.
Yeah, obviously, because you're obviously a god. You're part of the Anor Londo pantheon, right? And obviously there's also the Izalith pantheon and Nido and stuff. So there, you have this idea of collectively the gods, right? And the idea is that you can join an individual cult dedicated to one god that serves your purposes. Like you said, maybe you want like an ocean-faring god who maybe will help you somehow with the fishing. But like most people who are living on land and stuff like that, they're going to want to have a harvest god like Guinevere, and that's why she's loved by mankind and quote unquote loved by all, right? Because it's just like that's so adaptive to everyone.
Do you want to talk about Ulasil and how they're digging into the dark kind of screwed things over?
Yeah, Ulasil's the perfect example of this, right? Because Ulasil is this kingdom, as we know, like the big like idea is that Manus is this dark sorcerer that's buried underground in the royal wood, or the royal family's forest garden, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea is that the point being is that this is where, like, again, the implication seems to be that Manus is basically this old sorcerer who is there at the foundation of Ulasil, right? Like his staff is this axe shaped, so not like the peaceful Ulasil we know now, much more warlike, has this obviously dark sorcery, not the light sorcery that we see now, and of course he is is still around, so he has the symbol of the dark sign on him. Dark Souls 2 sort of hints on that with Dark Lurker and things like that. But the point being is that like Manus is sort of this early like human from way back in Ulasil's foundation that's sort of being buried here. There's all this ceremony to him, so clearly he was a very important figure. And nowadays, like, again, like Koth has to kind of tell you, hey, there's this guy buried underneath. Did you know about this? This is your history here. And it sort of gives you the idea. And Ring City establishes this in the same way. Like at the time that the events of the Undeath show up, Ulasil knows about the Ring City and the Pygmies and all that, and they have diplomatic delegations still going there. But they're using light sorcery already. So like the gods, by like Anor Londo is literally right next door to Ulasil.
Yes.
Its church has the ruins of the church have a direct connection to Sen's fortress and then going up, right? We see evidence of a lot of the gods, a lot of Ulasilians becoming priests and stuff of that nature. Again, the Abyssal Archive will go in more detail into that. But what we see, generally speaking, is that Ulasil seems to be like, it's sort of like the test case, right? Like as soon as like the gods could show like Ulasil, this kingdom that has this history going back all the way to the Ring City, it may even be the first human country that's spread out after the Ring City. You have these humans who are sort of slowly, gradually twisted. So like, yeah, they use sorcery still, but it's not dark sorcery, it's light sorcery. They have all this light magic, and the gods are giving them this, with the mushrooms and the white trees and all this stuff, they're giving them the power of sunlight and lightning in order to help them develop these powers, and they become more reliant on miracles like Tranquil Walk of Peace, because Anor Londo's right here, and no one's going to attack them when Anor Londo's their neighbor, sort of protecting them as like their little vassal they are. So it's like everything's peaceful and nice, and we don't have to be like sort of fending for ourselves, and like, we could just just kind of enjoy ourselves here. And like, as we see that Ulasil becomes like this country that isn't very ambitious with its sorcery, even though it uses sorcery. So it's like a very, very different from how its origins seem to go back with madness. And this ties into just the general concept of the heathens, right? So the occult in Japanese is sort of this idea of evil or wicked faith, and it also has this connotation of being a false faith, because obviously the idea is that if your god is an evil god, then he's not really a god at all, because, you know, a god has to be good, right? Like, it has to be like, otherwise why would we worship him if he wasn't a good god, right? Like, that's the idea, right? Unless you're like an evil cultist or something, then for whatever reason you like the evil god. But that's the general like trope being played on there. And the idea is that you have the way of white, or the white faith, and then you have the occult, or the heathens, the wicked faith. And the idea is that these heathens, you know, they practice and they use the dark. We see this multiple times, but their dark is more of a faith than a sorcery, right? Like, they're the ones where it's like, you know, they live out in forests and outside of civilization. Like, they've been pushed out of civilization because, you know, the dark is kind of weird and spooky and has these strange powers kind of going with it. And they sort of have devolved into this faith where, as we see with the effigy shield, the effigy is supposed to actually be a wicked or false god. So the idea is that they start believing like, oh, where did this dark power come from? Oh, it came from this, like, you know, pagan god that we came up with, kind of like with the Shadowmen and Shrine of Storms and Stonefang and things like that, right? Same kind of general ideas. Like, we have this power, we know it exists, but we don't really kind of understand, so we come up with our own stories and justifications for why it exists. And we kind of, so it even shows that even those who still practice the dark, they've kind of forgotten their history over the time. That things are kind of getting twisted and they're not being widely accepted the same way. And it's not going well for the Pygmies' big plan, right?
Yeah. Now we talked about how, you know, carrot and stick. So long as you don't actively, as they're trying this sort of cultural drift experiment and they're slowly trying to get everybody on their side. We talked about this with Oscar. You don't need to control everyone. But so long as you don't actively oppose the gods, you're like, you can not buy into it. You cannot look at Gwyn as your ultimate savior. But it's not a good idea to try to oppose him in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, the moment you speak up, Kjaran and the Lord's Blades are going to come in and go, and they're going to knack you. And then you're going to be now your corpse that has been clearly killed by these assassins, Gwyn's personal, like, assassins, right? Mm-hmm. They're going to now make you an example of what not to do. And this obviously becomes carried on by the Gwendolyn and the Dark Moon Blades later on, but the idea is that, like, Kieran and the Lord's Blades did it first. When Gwyn first establishes his kingdom, he's like, okay, whoever the god's enemies are, you just get them and make sure that they don't start spreading these heretical ideas, right? And so people start getting scared and like, okay, I better just keep my head down. So even if you don't believe it, you're not. And while everything else, the propaganda is going to be talking about how great the medials are. They're these gods. We love them. They're so amazing and they're helpful, right? And eventually just everyone starts believing it, right? Because eventually all the people who don't, they kept silent. They're going to die. Maybe whatever they wrote down or anything that knowledge they possess is going to get forgotten or drift, and things get twisted and perverted. And the only ones that remember are these heathens who are been pushed out. They live in forests and, you know, valleys and stuff. Like, for example, Server, the weapon you find at the Valley of the Poison Swamp in Blighttown, that's a sacrificial blade, right? It's and the idea is that it has some of that occult power because it helps you. It functions sort of like Life Drain in Dark Souls 3, where when you kill enemies, you get life out of it and stuff like that, right? So this idea of, okay, the life-eating power of the dark is there, and it's used in these like animal or maybe even human sacrifice type of deal. And these are people who are living out in these like remote valleys and places away from where the city folk are.
Yeah. So this is. You package all of this history, and again, I go back to this idea that you need to add hundreds of years between all the frames in the opening cinematic,
possibly thousands even. So like,
yeah, we're now finally getting to the Dragon Wars.
Right. Finally, now all of this happens. Now, Dark Souls 3 Ring City obviously clarifies that at least the Ring Knights of the Ring City get involved in this. But the idea is that the cinematic doesn't show us exactly how extensive human involvement was, right? But the idea is that all four lords essentially took part. And the gods have prepared, right? Like, they've developed spears for this. They've developed, like, the whole cross spear and things that get, like, obviously Dark Souls 3 expands onto the development of this. It starts with a sword spear and eventually becomes the spear that Ornstein uses. But the idea is basically the same, is that they've been training, they've been preparing, they've gathered allies, and everything's going as Gwyn wants now. Now he's ready, he wants to hunt the dragons. And we see the results. they have the advantage. Now, Goff tells us that despite all these ups and positives that they got going for them, it's still a very tough battle. Like, for every one dragon they're slaying, a bunch more of their own are also getting slain. So it's definitely not an easy thing, but like they ultimately win. And we can see this dehumanizing aspect, right? Because we see with Seath and stuff that these dragons have names. They're people. You can communicate and reason with them, right?
Yeah.
So the gods could have treated them as like any other race and had peaceful relations. But Gwyn wasn't interested in that. He wanted to hunt them like beasts. Because again, as we go back to this idea, if you don't have these cities, if you don't have these hierarchies and civilizations, you're just an animal. So that's how Gwyn and his kingdom and all the other lords with their kingdoms treated the dragons, and they ended up hunting them down until they were defeated.
They went a bit further than that, though. Let's first talk about, you have something you pointed out to me was that the Drake head models in Anor Londo are actually, like, they are supposed to be dragons.
Yeah. So like drakes are wyverns, actually. They're supposed, because the idea is that the everlasting dragons are ancient or old dragons. Dark Souls 3 localizes them as archdragons, and then the drakes are supposed to be wyverns or flying dragons, right? Because they don't have like front legs. They just have like their front legs are basically fused with their arms, essentially, with the wings. Mm-hmm. So the point being here is that the wyvern heads are clearly supposed to be archdragon heads based on what we get in the item description with the boar helm, right? Like they cut off the dragon heads and all that, and then they mount them as trophies and things like that. Like that was the idea of, we defeated them, we get the bodies. Witch of Izalith, you can have the rest, but we'll take the heads. And then we see this again in Dark Souls 3 Ring City with the shields, right? Like some of the ring knights do the same practice, right? And we see this consistently, right? Like the humans are inheriting culture, like the idea of wearing a crown. That's unique to Anor Londo and human society. The idea of cutting off the heads, that's unique to Anor Londo and the Pygmy Ring Knights. So you kind of see how much Anor Londo, among all the lords, Anor Londo especially, is inserting its influence among the Pygmies, even going into the dragon hunts.
Yes. And in the dragon hunts, we have Ornstein and Goff making a name for themselves. Kieran and Artorias, they're probably not in the dragon hunts, ?
Yeah, we don't really... So, like, Goff, we see he has medals, and he has dragon bones, and Ornstein,
he talks about he's known fighting as the there.
Yeah, he's a dragon slayer. Like, he has the title Dragon Slayer, so clearly he was a dragon slayer. So, like, you have these characters who clearly were involved in these hunts and stuff like that. Obviously, Dark Souls 3 clarifies that Ornstein was specifically the Firstborn's first knight, and obviously just by the fact that the Firstborn's depicted with a cross spear, Ornstein has a cross spear, they obviously were comrades, like, they were the vanguard against the dragon hunts, while Goff is, like, in the back here with his entire like archer unit of silver knights who are like just, you know, shooting down these dragons from far away, while the spear wielders are like trying to dodge these attacks and then like counter with their spears and things like that and pierce in. Because the idea is like, and obviously Gwyn's also, we see in the cinematic, he's sharing some of his lightning power with other silver knights, and they're all just hurling these bolts of lightning at the dragons. And even Dark Souls 3 Ring City shows us that if you're a woman, one of the rare woman silver knights who aren't like becoming a Lord's Blade or something like that, you got these like lightning bow miracles, so that way you too can also do it. See, Gwyn that's a good thing we could say about Gwyn. He's very egalitarian, right? He allows men and women to fight equally on the battlefield. And
Seath. Seath is also he's a very important character in the Dragon War. You told me that there's no secret sharing when Seath enters the picture.
Yeah, this is surprisingly common misassumption that people make, in that, okay, well, Gwyn, the reason why Seath is so loved and cherished by Gwyn and has all these rewards and accolades and stuff is because he's a confidant, and a confidant means someone who shares a secret with the other person. So Seath shared the secrets on how to defeat the dragons and all that. Well, no. We see how much training and work and effort do so. So while it was hard, the gods clearly were winning and having the advantage, right? Like, all the lords are playing their part well, and eventually the dragons are going down. What happens with Seath is he's just an ally, just a generic word for someone who basically he switches over to sides, right? And as the Japanese for the cinematic makes it clear, it's that Seath is responsible for helping close out the war. Thanks to him betraying the dragons, and as we can see it, he's standing on a pile of their corpses, finally the dragons are defeated and the lords have won, right? So, like, there isn't like this like big like secret conspiratorial aspect to it. It's just like Seath was fighting on the dragon side. We know this, of course, from Havel, one of Gwyn's comrade of arms during this.
he gets so mad at how Seath is whooping him that he basically decides he's going to hard counter all magic now. Like, it's like, no more, I will no longer be beaten by this sorcery. But eventually, as the war starts closing out, Seath sees the writing on the walls, and you know what? He never really liked his kind anyway. He's always been jealous and envious of them for having those scales that he doesn't have, and he's the founder of sorcery, so he already discovered, he's been already researching ways to do that, and you know what? The gods could really help him with his research, so you know what? He's gonna be on the winning side, and he just backstabs them, and as we can see, like, you see how many dragons are piled up on him as he crushes their scales in his hands, right? So, like we said, every dragon that the lords were slaying was killing, like, possibly dozens of their own, right? So, like, Gwyn's obviously going to be extremely happy with Seath, because, like, you know what? You're a dragon, but you're a good dragon, right? We see this consistently throughout everything we've talked about. When you do what Gwyn wants, when you are someone who's of great benefit to him, he's incredibly generous with you. He gives you all this status and accolades and things that you want or could want, and as long as you're not, like, as long as he's the one on top and he's the one making the decision. And in case of Seath, it's like, yeah, you know what? We're not going to hunt you down like the rest. We'll have you, and I'll make you a duke, and you'll be able to become a relative of mine by marrying my daughter. And, like, all this stuff going into it makes Seath this valued member of Anor Londo's society. And I actually talk a bit more about this on Sinclair's podcast.
Yes, you did an entire episode about Seath.
Yeah, so if you go watch that if you want to hear more. I'm not going to get into this too deep into specifics here. Let's focus on Gwyn. Yes.
Now, after the Dragon War, this is where things calm down significantly. There's a lot less coercive means to acquire power, at least for like this period of Gwyn's history, and it's relatively peaceful.
Things are. Yeah. There's still incidents and stuff. Again, we bring up the mimics. This is like this event, like the whole thing with branding some of his clansmen likely happened at this time. But as we can see, again, the mimics are proof that Gwyn generally doesn't try to kill one of his own. Like, if you're a god, like, sure, maybe you'll be degraded to becoming a security chest. We're not going to kill you, right? Like, I'm not going to send you to Smo to get smashed, right? Like, there's a certain respect for the other kind. So this, as we see, Nito's burial chamber is relatively empty. Like, it's not filled the same way that the Tomb of the Giants is with all the slaves.
It's a very bad idea to get the idea of gods being killable into the heads of the people.
Yeah. Like, the idea is, like, you know what? Like, we'll turn some gods if they do real bad things, like get a little too greedy for Gwyn. They'll get sort of the stick, but generally speaking, Gwyn's like, okay, I've established this religion with a morality, right? That you can be generous and wonderful and benevolent and loving and all that stuff. And there's this idea of knighthood, so there's honor and all these things. But when you strip away all of that, what you see is the knights just basically massacred an entire race.
Yeah.
Of
sentient
the gods
creatures.
Have completely. Yeah, the quote-unquote gods, the medials, have completely, essentially oppressed an entire other race. They've enslaved another race. So, like, you kind of have this thing where there's this whole prettying things up, right, by using things that we would associate with, like, say, real-life religions and cultures and things. But when you strip it down bare, you're like, ooh, this is looking real ugly.
Yeah, and it gets very uglier. Yeah, well, uglier. It gets ugly, even still. The bastardization of the dragons with the wyverns and the experiments the gods had on them.
Right, and not just the wyverns, even archdragons. So,
sure.
Yeah, so, like, the wyverns are the obvious example. We see blue wyverns in New Londo. They're obviously performing a sort of, like, a defense protection type of racket for the gods of Anor Londo who don't want New Londo and its abyss to go free and stuff like that. So it's like, okay, we'll just put a bunch of these wyverns in the valley where the entrance is, and that'll keep people away, right? And we know this because, obviously, the wyverns don't just breathe fire, they breathe lightning, right?
Yeah, which is really weird. Which is really weird when you, like, if you don't connect that to the gods, lightning is this... it's the weakness. How does this happen otherwise?
Yeah, right. Like, it's clearly an artificial thing. Like, this didn't happen naturally. And in the same respect, the wyverns and their lightning breath and things like that, we see this with the gargoyles, right? Like, the gargoyles in Anor Londo have a lightning breath, unlike the lesser gargoyles used in Undead Burg, right? Like, Anor Londo gives Undead Burg the weaker gargoyles to use for its trials and stuff, but the good ones, those are the ones that have the lightning breath and are used there. And in content, we know that those lightning wyverns were going to be flying around Anor Londo and shooting their lightning in the sky and stuff too, right?
Yeah.
So, like, we definitely can say for certain that, yeah, that's the intention there. And it wasn't just the wyverns, we also see the archdragons. It's not just wyverns in the Valley of Drakes, we also see this undead dragon, but it's more a dragon zombie because again, like undeath is a human thing, and the idea with the dragon zombie is like, you know, it looks like a party of like Astoran knights and stuff killed this dragon and it's like dead in the valley, right? And its lower half it's rotted and it fell into the valley, right? So it's just the front end, but because it's a dragon, it's got this immortality and things from its stone scales and stuff. As its body is rotting, it comes back to life, and now it's like this weird amalgamation. And Miyazaki says in an interview, this is to kind of give you the idea of like how sad a dying dragon is, right? Like they don't belong in this world anymore where fire and life, like you kind of see it creates this almost perversion of what they were when they were just eternal stone and they just existed forever without change.
You can see this also in the gaping dragon, which has sort of just become consumed and deformed with his hunger.
Yeah, and we see the same thing with the dragon zombie in the painting world, right? Like we see this painting world zombie protecting like Priscilla, like the area leading up to Priscilla, right? And it looks like it crashed down and it too rotted and stuff. And it's because so we have this idea that the gods weren't just killing the dragons and cutting off their heads. Some of them, you know, they kind of collected and kept around as like pets and slaves. Obviously, Dark Souls 3 has the firstborn have the storm drake or storm wyvern, right?
Yeah.
So like
it also introduces Midir.
Yeah, right. Dark Souls 3 also gives us Midir, who again, the Midir is specifically like a dragon that was collected from Seath, but obviously Seath's now one of the gods, right? He's in the club. He's now got the status of Duke and God and all these things.
Yeah.
So like he's now part of that entire culture of, okay, I'll just pick up this dragon. I can use this archdragon as part of my research and stuff like that, right? And again, same idea.
Is Seath the one who creates the Iron Golem?
There's never really any indication of it, but it does give us the idea that the gods have obviously they've entered their Iron Age already, so they can make a golem made of iron.
Yeah.
And the idea is that, okay, well, now that they've won the dragon hunts, you have this, take a bone of archdragons that we've killed, combine them with a soul, and like put that soul inside this giant iron armor vessel that we have, and now you can have this walking suit of armor that, even though it's so big and heavy, it still is relatively swift and strong. Like as we can see, whenever that thing swings its weapon, it's so fast and powerful that it creates this gust of wind, right, that can blow us back even from far away, right? So the idea is that the Iron Golem is this incredible technological achievement in golem craft made possible by the gods hunting the archdragons. So we see how even absent the primordial serpents and the whole fate of the world and all that stuff, the gods, the incentives were just there to just take the dragons and use them however they want, either as slaves, pets, as body parts, specimens to research, like no matter what it is, there was always a good thing, there was always a good reason for them to commit to these hunts, right?
Yeah.
And as far as we could tell, these hunts weren't like a reaction to anything, like, oh, the dragons are like hurting us. Like the archdragons don't care, like they're down there in the lower world enjoying it. It's not until after the hunts that we start seeing these really aggressive dragons, like say Hellkite or Calamite or things like that.
Yeah. It's in this peaceful-ish interim period that,
as we can see, Gwyndolin is born. Gwyn has Gwyn has another child. Well, is this with his queen? Well, he doesn't have a lot of the same traits as his queen, as we see, and he's got a dark moon affinity, not a sunlight affinity. That this moon affinity ends up having Gwyn decide, oh well, he's actually he's a she, right? He's a daughter. He's like we can't have anything like that. And some people are like, oh no, did Gwyn not know about Gwyndolin and things like that? No. Gwyn definitely knew about Gwyndolin. Like just look at the graphic for Miracles. You can see there's Gwyn with his Lord Soul, and he's like addressing the Silver Knights in Anor Londo and stuff like that. And right there behind him, you see that little strip of white and that little dark dot on the head, and you're like, oh hey, that's Gwyndolin. And it's much more clear in Dark Souls 3 because they like I think they redo the art or they upscale it, but it becomes much more obvious.
Yeah,
there's Gwyndolin standing there, and just generally speaking, like Gwyndolin has to move into Gwyn's tomb. Obviously, that tomb has to exist before he can do so. So we don't see his room in Anor Londo or anything like that in their royal manor that we break into. It's very clear that he was around, he was present, he was known about. That's why they had to pretend that he was a she. And he's supposed to be considered one of the old gods, and he has his own following that get buried, like in the catacombs and things like that. That's where we get one of his the Dark Moon Seance ring, which is actually again a priest ring, not a seance ring, because that's the person buried there is one of Gwyndolin's priests. As we can see, Gwyndolin sort of starts embodying the feminine ideal, and we see the same statue of baby Guinevere in the queen's hands, sort of behind this priest statue, because again, Guinevere is obviously like the picture perfect of femininity. And I'll be talking actually with Sinclair, again, podcast on Gwendolyn more, because there's a lot to go into with Gwendolyn and his parentage and things like that. And it's best if we kind of all talk about it there, because this is starting to get a little off topic on Gwyn, and admittedly talks about a very not safe for work aspect of Gwyn's character.
I don't want to be demonetized, so I'm putting the muscle on this, Loki. Prior to the first flame beginning to wane, Smo rejected from the Four Knights?
Yeah, because as we see, Gwyn is, as we said, Gwyn does a lot of terrible things, but he's not a psychopath, at least. Again, another positive we can say this. Smo is obviously this terrible, like, he's everything that Anor Londo society tries to acts like it's not, right? He's not honorable, he's not, he's not, generous, he's not, this good person. He's just this shamelessly nasty person who takes joy in killing and doing so in the most brutal ways imaginable. Like, he doesn't use a sword to execute people like is the honorable way in medieval societies. He has this big hammer and he just crushes your blood and your blood and your bones and all that. And so while you're sort of like becoming a pancake by him, Smo though wants to be a knight, right? And he obviously wears like this knightly armor that we see, though it's a bit weird and atypical. That's actually the reason why Miyazaki wanted Smo to be this very atypical character in Anor Londo society, was because of his atypical design. But the general point being made here is that Smo wanted to be one of the knights honored by Gwyn, like the Four, but Gwyn ultimately said no. Right. And so it's like, okay, well, at least Gwyn, again, it's a very low bar, but at least Gwyn is like, you know what? I shouldn't make a psychopath and a knight. That might not be the most wise decision. And obviously, you can imagine like more like knights who really believe in this whole honor shtick, like Ornstein and Artorias and stuff. They might be a little uncomfortable if someone like Smo suddenly rises to the rank for this.
Yeah, I'm not willing to give Gwyn any points for this one. It seems purely motivated by this guy being a knight is going to do more damage than good.
Yeah, right, exactly. Because again, they at least need to have the appearance of legitimacy, right? Like, yeah, like, okay, we're good, we're honorable, we're the moral party. We are your moral example you want to follow and listen and serve us. All
right. So, fire begins to fade.
Yeah. So finally, all of this has been building up to this one moment. Everything's going good,
and then undeath appears.
Yes. So, the gods are spooked by this. Again, as we mentioned earlier, they bricked up the way to Anor Londo, right? Like, you can't just walk in from Sen's fortress anymore. You gotta have the Batwing. You have to have the Batwing demons kind of carry you up in there, right? Like, the gods have to kind of initiate the whole travel process. You ain't scaling that mountain by yourself. And as we see, Sen's fortress itself has become a prison. It has prison facilities sort of crudely sort of plugged in here with all these cages and things. So the idea is like, obviously now, okay, when humans used to regularly come in here and traffic into Anor Londo through Sen's fortress, well, now we gotta check them because undeath is now a thing. And it's like, it just suddenly happened. Suddenly humans just stopped just dying. And it's like, well, what? Why? And not only are they just not dying, they're now going crazy and they're starting to kill other people. And then these people become these strange undead. And then they have this strange hollowing where they lose their personality and their will and who they once were and become these empty shells which just like sort of instinctively hunger for souls, these soul-starved, you might say. And then these soul-starved hollows start destroying entire civilizations, as we see with Baldur, right? Like, Baldur's this old kingdom, it's lasted for so long, and then suddenly it had too many hollows, and that completely just caused it to collapse, right? Obviously, similar to how we see things working out in Demon Souls with Bolatari and stuff like that. But again, same idea. And the gods, they're spooked, and now it's got to be, okay, Anor Londo's on lockdown. We gotta really kind of be careful who we're letting in now, because things are going strange with the dark.
Yeah, and they eventually figure out that this is actually their own fault.
They're hoisted by their own petard, right? So like the all of this is because of the dark sign, which again, this is as Aldia calls it, the first sin, right? The moment the gods put these shackles on mankind and sealed the dark away from them, they sealed their fate with this, right? Like, now they're stuck with undeath, because what are they gonna do? Do they undo the seal of fire? Well, now they're gonna have the problem before where all the humans have the dark, right? And they've had the seal on for so long that humans have been so estranged from the dark that's basically this ravenous like independent soul that's existing inside, and it's eating the white soul that humans have been developing, where all their consciousness and personality is. So like they're like in a real terrible dilemma now. So because everything, like, they can't basically acknowledge, they can't basically fix this problem without basically giving away to humans that not only did they cause it in the first place, but they're basically, again, the whole history of oppressing their heritage, scrubbing out things, trying to make them forget about who they were, as Koth says, making them go senile as the years have progressed over time.
And this is also where we start seeing some rebellions.
Yes, right? Because now, again, we talked about all those heathens who are pushed out of society, right? Now this is their moment, right? Their gods have spoken. The dark is on the rise. Everything's, like, going up, right? And it's like, well, there's a bit of a problem. The gods are still around, so, like, what are we gonna do? Well, now's the time to get rid of them, right? Like, yeah, what else are we gonna do?
Gamers, rise up.
Yeah, so you have all these heathens who, as we see in Nito's case, they start going after Nito because it's like, hey, Nito, you haven't been bringing death to the gods. You do it to the giants, you do it to the animals, you do it to the humans, but you're not doing this whole bringing death cult thing to the gods. Like, hey, can you give us some of that power so we can do that? Obviously, they're not asking nicely, they're just going for it, right? Like, we see this with Nito and the Tomb of the Giants when you get the silver serpent ring. Obviously, serpents associated with the primordial serpents, with undeath because of the greedy nature, with, of course, just this general idea of the dark, right? And it's specifically a ring that helps you collect more souls, right? So you get this idea, and as soon as you start collecting it from the corpse there, a bunch of bone towers scale up. So Nito's obviously very sensitive about you having this. So there's this clear indication that they want the power of Nito's death soul in order to help bring death to the gods, right? And they end up failing. Like, they try their hardest and it doesn't work out for them. Surprisingly, the god of death is able to just kill them.
Yeah. Shock.
Yeah. So, like, but again, this sort of gives you the idea that the gods have reason to want to, the Anor Londo has reason to want to lock down and, like, not get involved in all this, because things are really going bad around here, and there's a problem. But that also creates an issue, right? You can't just, like, hunker down inside your city, your country, and just hope that everything's going to be okay, right? Like, you can't have the "this is fine" meme with the dog, right?
You
like,
need you need to act in the
apart.
world as well.
Yeah. And so, like, the gods start branding undead as unholy monsters, and from there...
Yes, they create the Way of White.
Yes. Because you have to think about this. Before, it was, okay, you could just, it didn't matter what god you believed in, as long as you believe in a god. And if you don't, that's okay. There's plenty of gods for you to choose from. Eventually, you'll come around, right? And then if you still don't want to, and you start getting start voicing like how we're actually like these evil, awful oppressors that are slowly stripping you of your heritage, then we'll kill you. But now we can't play like nice anymore, right? Now we can't like just have everyone like believe their own things and they worship a specific god, and that's all fine and dandy, right? Like, it's fine that the gods have their individual priests who are really dedicated to them, right? But we have to now have a unified message that is to all the humans, or at least all the humans who are within our sphere of influence, that we can basically, because obviously Dark Souls 2, they don't reach like the Dark Souls 2 setting and Dark Souls 3 setting, stuff happens later, right? So, but basically, as far as Dark Souls 1 is concerned, we need to get all the humans that we're aware of under our banner, and making sure that they're not like, listening to all these heretics and stuff that are rising up and causing problems, right? Plus, undeath is a problem, and we don't want all our nice little servants who we like to have, like, do whatever we want for our individual cults, like, all gone and dead, right? So let's deal with this undeath problem. Okay, we'll create the Way of White. It's this church that'll have this one singular message, and its goal is to, as we see with the Crescent Axe, it's given to higher ranked members of the Way of White, and specifically, the Japanese text tells us it's a waxing Crescent Axe. It's like a 3-day moon, because around the third day or fourth day, the moon starts going from a new moon to a crescent moon. It's gaining light now. So this idea of, okay, in the cinematic, undeath is described as this night, like the power of the first flame no longer reaches the world of man, human society, and they're now only existing in this quote-unquote night, right? It's a figurative night, not a literal night. And the idea is that, okay, well, the Crescent Axe represents how the Way of White is going to come in, and it's going to bring light to this night, right? It's going to be the one that's going to add the power of the gods, the holy magic of light, to this night and help save humanity, right? And that's sort of
It's a really,
that's sort of the goal.
It's a really beautiful doubling down on your bullshit. Like, just the escalation of lies upon lies, where you're just
and you can't, and like we said, they can't admit to the lies, so they have to
you're in too deep.
like it's, and again, like I said, Gwyn was the unlucky one. The moment he found the light soul, he was screwed. This was all basically going to happen, and he owns all of it because the gods could have at any point, like, again. The gods could have at any point been like, okay, humans, we're gonna work with you, and we could let's diversify, let's be like Velka and have a little bit of dark here, right? Like, so that way we're not all let's not put all our stocks into the light soul, right? Let's kind of diversify our portfolio. But no, they were like, no, we're great and we're wonderful, and their arrogance is their undoing.
I would have argued that the moment the pygmy split the Dark Souls is the moment where their fate was sealed, because. Couldn't Gwyn, if he could have gotten to the furtive pygmy, couldn't he have just stolen his soul?
Yeah, he could have theoretically, kill the pygmy, take the soul. Yeah, again, but again, you could say that too. But my point is basically the moment Gwyn found the light soul and not the dark soul, he was unlucky. The universe is literally arranged where the moment the pygmy found the dark soul, everything was set for humanity one way or another.
It could have been. There is a timeline where Dark Souls is the story of how Gwyn was actually magnanimous, and he was actually helping people, and then, as the Age of Fire ended, he, magnanimously stepped down and allowed humans to take their place, and humans were like, hey, you remember this god who, helped us for thousands of years and who gave us all these blessings? Yeah, let's revere him. Let's actually respect this guy.
Well, it probably wouldn't have even made them think of them as gods, right? They just would have been another race working together. It's right now my power is great and everything's going to be good and wonderful, and then your power eventually will rise to the top. We can clearly do that by studying the world and the cosmology. We know where this is all going. And everything will be all dandy. Instead, they tried to basically seal it and pretend that the dark was never going to come. Even when it did, they would still have plenty. They would be able to deal with this. There wouldn't have any issues. They already sealed away the dark, so they don't have to worry about any of this rebellion and possibly coming in conflict with the pygmies. We're going to be in charge forever. And then when the fire finally did fade, they were blindsided. And when they figured out what the problem was, all they could do was double down and stick with it. Because they could never think of something like, well, maybe we should kind of, maybe lean off the light and go into the dark, right?
Yeah. And if you want to see another showcase of, because again, Gwyn will team up with giants. He will team up with dragons. He will not team up with humans. And you see this with how he elevates Lloyd to lead the Way of White, rather than letting a human do it.
Right? Because he doesn't trust humans. Mm-hmm. Just fundamentally, he doesn't trust them. So, again, and it makes sense why Lloyd specifically was chosen, right? You need someone close to you in the royalty. Okay, well, Lloyd's a royal, and he somehow's not dead yet, so, okay, that's one box checked off. Okay, well, what next do we do? Okay, well, old man Lloyd, my uncle, wonderful dude, I love you. Can you, go out into this dangerous human world with so many unknown threats that we don't know, what could possibly come at you? There's all these heathens, possibly these little cults and, evil tribes out there that might come out of the forest and stuff and attack you or whatever. But, can you go out there and, lead this church and make sure that this human church doesn't somehow become this heretical church and this all backfires on us, right? Just make sure that we have this base in the human world that we can operate from. So that way, Anor Londo, us gods here, we can be safe. And out there, we can make sure that humans are coming back under our control, and everything's not all slipping bad, and we find ourselves surrounded by enemies on all sides, right?
And in the human world, he establishes the land of Thorland.
Yeah. So Thorland in Japanese means basically Soul Londo. So the idea is basically you have Anor Londo, which in Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien's Elvish for Lord of the Rings fame is basically meaning the haven of the sun, right? And obviously very appropriate for the gods of light. But then you have the Soul Londo, which means the same thing, basically, right? You just change the Anor to the Latin Sol, meaning sun, and it's, again, still the haven of the sun. So the idea is basically, Lloyd is establishing his own little Anor Londo, in the human world, and the humans are basically, the humans there is, he's gonna be, quote unquote, in charge. Now, he's called Allfather now, but Allfather means, chief god. So he's not literally the father of all, he's just the god in charge, as of the Dark Souls 1's events.
Allfather is the localization for chief god, is what you're saying.
Yeah. So, what it's saying, it's not saying that he's the father of all, literally. It's saying that he's the head of the gods, head of the pantheon, right? Like Zeus or Odin, etc., right? In Greek or Nordic mythologies and stuff like that. What happens, though, is that, obviously, at this period, Gwyn's the chief of the god. He's the chief god, because he's the king of the gods. Of course he's the chief, right? So even if that title didn't exist at this point, he's effectively ruling in that manner. And so Lloyd, at this point, he doesn't become Allfather, quote-unquote, until later. He doesn't become the leader of the Pantheon until, obviously, Gwyn's out of the picture.
Yes.
And obviously, because again, how else is he going to justify becoming the chief god except by his relation to Gwyn? And this becomes obviously a huge point in Dark Souls 3 because Lloyd loses his status once a more worthy heir becomes obvious in the form of Gwendolyn. Gwendolyn comes out as a male, and suddenly Gwyn finds himself like, hey, maybe we should have like everyone, all the humans are basically going, hey, maybe we should have the actual son of Gwyn be our leader of the pantheon instead of this guy who's just his uncle. He's not even part of the main branch of the family.
Hey, a bit of side tangent. Do you think the Nameless King, if he would have come back, do you think he could have reformed Anor Londo to be like, hey, we could be friends with the dragons?
Oh well, if they wouldn't, they wouldn't have pushed him out in the first place.
Well, no, I'm also thinking in the sense of Anor Londo, circa Dark Souls 3. Not
most
so
of the gods are dead by then. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Most of the it's basically just Gwendolyn, and he doesn't last very long by the time we get there.
That's true. So the Lloyd Knights begin to hunt the Hollows.
Right. So, Lloyd establishes knights, right? And they're the big tanky guys, right? They got the big thick armor, and they look like fat boys, right? And the idea is that they're just going to tank through these hordes of hollows, right? And they have these miracles like replenishment, which help keep them, they're still healing over time. So even as they're, getting, their thick armor gets pierced, and they get, torn apart a little bit, scratched and stuff by these monsters or cut up or things like that, they're able to just tank through it all, right? And this and obviously Lloyd's whole shtick is using, white halos of light, these rings of light similar to the orange light we see in Anor Londo with Sen's Fortress going up. He has these white rings of light, and he basically sort of infuses this in all these miracles. Lloyd starts simplifying miracles, so you abridge a miracle, and that miracle it has less power and potency, but it still is able to it becomes easier to learn. You don't need as much faith in order to manifest its power and things like that. So you have these simplified stories going out. So basically the point is to make sure that we're going to make sure that as many humans as possible are able to hear the word of God and follow it. It's going to be this one unified word. It's no longer all these different cults or things. If they get some followers who want to be their priests, fine. But our focus as the Way of White, the white faith, is going to be making sure that everything is everyone's on the same page, and that it's this holy message that everyone's going to follow and listen to us, and you're not going to start rebelling.
Yeah, and this is where they also because you have the undead, people become scared. The Way of White emerges as saviors. People begin to you look pretty favorably on your saviors, and when they start to sort of scrub heathen elements from your society, you don't ask questions.
Right, exactly. We see this with, the Dark Ember, right? The Dark Ember is only found in the painting world, right?
Yes.
And now, at least. Once it used to be, things where heathens probably had it all over. But as soon as the Way of White's around, now it's going through and it's making sure, okay, we can't just tolerate these things that exist, and as long as they don't actively oppose us, we're okay with that. No, now it's okay, all this dark stuff, it's just gone. We're gonna make sure all the humans forget about it. As we see with Ulasil in Ring City, the pygmies, Ulasil knows about them. They're having delegations, but now that the dark and undeath is becoming a problem, okay, we're locking down the Ring City. It's gonna be quarantined, right? We're not allowing anyone else to go in here. And between that and all the way going up until the events of Ulasil in the DLC, suddenly Ulasilians have no idea what the dark is or anything about their dark history or any of that. It's oh, well, what is that? So we see how once the Way of White is introduced, things get scrub. Gotta make sure all that history is gone. We can't allow any single memory of it. We can't allow any of it to exist and be it can no longer be this thing that's kind of on the fringes and stuff like that. And we see this with Ariamis, right? Any heresy, the gods were just kind of Lloyd and the Way of White were just kind of sending if they didn't kill it, they sent it back to Anor Londo as these prisoners to interrogate and stuff in the painting world, because the painting world of Ariamis is a prison basically, right? It's this prison world that's created in the form of a painting as its only portal, right? Which, hey, ideal prison, only one way in and out.
Mm-hmm.
And the point with the Ariamis paintings, you have pyromancers, you have dark heathens, you have all these different people, and they're all basically being sent in there if they're
you have Xanthus King Jeremiah.
You have the blood shield, you have all these are examples of all these things that the gods don't want existing in the world anymore. They have no place to belong, so now they can find a place to belong in this prison world.
Yes.
And the prison becomes this only place where we see surviving elements. Blacksmiths today, they don't know what a Dark Ember is. Andre sees that, I don't know what that thing is. I kind of want to experiment with it. Andre, come Dark Souls 3. Oh, that's dark, man. Oh, well, okay, I guess I'll help you, but hey, don't forget that you gotta believe in the Age of Fire and holiness, right? Like we see the difference between Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3, Andre. How ignorant humans are about the dark, if they're not in the know, right? If you're just your ordinary blacksmith out in the boonies or in the city or something like that.
Yeah. After the adventures in Ariamis, we get to New Londo.
Yes. So New Londo is this. New Londo is basically this undead ruin. It was an undead city, right? And the idea is, okay, so we're getting rid of all these insane undead that are like kind of creating a zombie apocalypse over in the world of man, right? Like, so we're getting rid of all those thanks to Lloyd and his knights in the Way of White, right? And we're scrubbing out all the dark, and we're able to interrogate some of these elements, but most of them we just want dead and gone, right?
Yeah.
But what about the regular undead? Those that haven't gone crazy yet and are still God-fearing, right? Because we've now branded them all as unholy monsters, and they're like, oh no, we don't want to be unholy monsters, we just want to die, as has always been the case for our kind. Always. Wink, wink. And it's like, okay, we want to enjoy death. Well, what are we going to do with these humans, right? So the gods have a dilemma. Well, Gwyn, being Gwyn, is like, okay, we'll create this city, much like with the Ring City, much like with Ulasil, all this thing, and we'll have all these humans, these undead, come to this big city we built for them, right? And all the undead come here. It's like, okay, so all these undead we gather in this city, and then Gwyn's like, oh, there's these 4 guys who they look like they could be good leaders. I'm going to elevate you, and I'm going to make you kings. But, you're not real, like, obviously, you're our vassal kingdom, right? So,
Yeah.
like, we don't want you just to be kings in the same way that the lords are kings. We want you to be, like, public officials, like you're the bureaucrats in our little hierarchy here. So instead, the 4 kings are basically called official or public kings or something to that effect. That basically just means that they're not, like they're kings, but, they're clearly delineated as not being like, they're like the sub-king.
And that's
the true king, which is Gwyn.
And that's why there's 4 of them. We talked about this in another failed recording. 4 because... You don't really get consensus with 4.
Yeah, it's the thing that if you had 3, there would always be a majority. When there's 4, you could have deadlocks, and that's what Gwyn wants. He wants humans making as few independent individual choices as possible, because that lessens the chance that they'll ever all agree, that they'll ever have a rebellion, right? Because if two people are like, we don't really agree with what the gods are doing, and 2 of them say, no, we're going to get the gods, then you know what? That's going to keep things as the same, and that's completely fine with Gwyn. He wants to not have any radical changes. Same thing with the pygmies, right? Like the pygmies, it isn't just a single pygmy lord. We see there's a council of lords by the events of the Ring City, right? So like it's the same idea. Gwyn fears humans. He fears their dark, and so he can't allow them to ever have this same singular absolute power to make their own decisions as independent agents.
Note also that the sliver of the soul that he gave to them is significantly smaller than the one he gave to Seath.
Yeah. Like you see, Seath gets this nice big piece of the Lord Soul. As far as the in-game graphics are concerned, it's the same. It looks the same as Nito's, as Isolith's, as Gwyn, as even Gwyn's, right? So the idea is like, okay, they get a pretty big piece, but then you get to the New Londo, and these 4 kings who basically are sharing like one soul, one big soul, of a piece of Gwyn's Lord Soul, his Light Soul, is this little bit thinner, right? Like, can't let them have the same amount of power either. It's got to be a little bit less. Like, I'm giving you a lot, but it's not going to be as much as I would normally give to someone I really liked. Because you're not really my friend. I'm just trusting these humans who are right at our doorstep to make sure that they effectuate my will.
Yes. Gwyn also, because Gwyn realized you needed to have game mechanics, he allied with he worked with Nito to create the bonfires and the Rite of Kindling. This I'll take the leash off in just a moment. I love how if you just play Dark Souls, everything is set up so that you actually buy into like the myth of fire linking. Like you look at it, the game, like you are actually rewarded for partaking in the system that Gwyn sets up.
Right, like and that's the point, right? Like the idea with this game mechanic is to reflect how Gwyn is trying to condition humans to think of fire good, dark bad. You want to get rid of the dark and exercise it so that way more fire gets stronger and bigger and better.
Yeah,
yes,
burn the
good.
humanity, burn it, feed the fire.
Yeah, feed the flame with humans, and then we see how this plays into New Londo, right? So obviously Nito's involved in this because there's the whole death thing. So like obviously you're gonna go to the god of death and be like, hey, god of death, you have this expertise. What can we do? And they start creating bonfires, which are made of obviously bones of
buddy old
pal.
pal.
Exactly. And he's like, I know I've kind of ignored you all this time and just let you do your own thing. And it's been great. Like you haven't killed my people. I've let you kill everyone else's people. So like it's a great arrangement we got here.
But Nito, people aren't dying anymore. And this is a both of us problem. So why don't we work together?
Exactly, right? Like we have a mutual shared interest in this. So then they invent bonfires. You take some bones of the undead, you gather them up, you set them, you somehow do some magical woobity-wah connected to the first flame, and now it's all these bonfires are now in this big first flame network, right? And you're burning undead bones. And you know what? What if we want to make these flames even bigger? And Nito's like, well, Gwyn, I've got a thing to sell you. In fact, I won't even sell it, I'll just give it to you. It's this rite of kindling. You just take this piece of humanity, this dark soul, you do this weird woobity-wah ceremony thing, and suddenly it's burning in the fire, and the fire is getting bigger. And with the heat of the bonfire, you can take that heat, somehow that heat becomes liquid form. We put it inside these special flasks that we make. We'll make them out of souls of these things we call fire keepers. I'll tell you the details later. And then we go in and we have now this stronger, more powerful heat of the bonfire to heal these undead, which are going to be very important because we want these undead to stay dependent on us and they'll like it. And don't worry, Lloyd has already figured it out. He's going to create these special talismans that'll seal their ability to use this thing we call Estes, and then he can hunt them down all the same, and we don't have to worry about this possibly being used against us.
Yeah. This is also where we get the fire keepers.
Yeah. Firekeeper, same shtick, right? We see with like Arena in Dark Souls 3, but even Anastasia in Dark Souls 1, her outfit has become gray because of the ash from the bonfires and stuff. Mm-hmm. But she is she is one of the Way of White's holy women, and they get this special uniform when they travel. It's like this ivory stuff. It's based on Guinevere because Guinevere is helping out with the Way of White during all this. Like she's sort of like Gwyn sort of delegates to her to help Lloyd and all this stuff, right? And the idea is like, okay, they get this special uniform and they'll become firekeepers, right?
Yeah. I wonder, is it exclusively women just because that's like they chose clergy women to mimic like Guinevere and it's just tradition that it's been done that way, or is there something special about women that makes good firekeepers that men couldn't do?
Women have much like in Demon Souls with magic in that game, in Dark Souls, women have a special capacity with souls, and we see this with twin humanities. So, women corpses in Dark Souls 1 are the only ones that give us twin humanities. And it's not even exclusive to just humans because they're humans. Quelaag gives us twin humanities when we slay her. So same spiel.
Huh. I never thought of that.
Yeah, women have this unique capacity where they create this sort of pairs with souls. And it makes sense because they're the child bearers. Yeah. So when, daddy gives some of his soul, mommy already has her soul, and then they kind of need some of that soul to go in and help create this new child that's going to be separate from mommy's soul, right? And that seems to be, and presumably there's some similar function in other humans who don't have dark souls, but it's the same concept, right?
Is this another Shinzo Abeism?
Trying to make sure we up the Japanese birth rate. I don't know. You never know. I think this is back in 2011, though, so maybe not.
Oh, yeah. Doesn't he become PM in, 2012?
Yeah, much later. Again...
we get the firekeepers, and this is also the time where criminals are being siphoned out and sacrificed at Firelink Shrine.
Yeah, because when you see New Londo, there's the big building in New Londo, which is as cut dialogue. There's certain ways you can figure out in game, though it's a bit subtle. But cut dialogue tells us from Ingward that that big building is supposed to be a dining hall. There's a huge eating culture in New Londo, and this is something that Abyssal Archive will go in because that's very important for many other things. But the general idea is that so the gods have created this city, and it's separated, so there's the city part, but the part that connects to Firelink Shrine, and Firelink Shrine is basically an extension of New Londo. They have the same architectural style, and obviously there's a lift connecting the two, so the idea is basically Firelink Shrine is just basically New Londo topside, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is that the part where you go from New Londo to Firelink Shrine is the prison area. We obviously see it's this big segregated area. Obviously, we have to use a wooden bridge over the flooded areas that was haphazardly added, but the idea is that the city is separate from the prison, and you see Rickard locks himself in one of the cells and stuff, and it's very clear the idea is, okay, when we got criminals, we siphon them out of society, and we take them up the lift, we lock them up in where Anastasia is now in that prison, and eventually we'll take them out of that prison and we'll move them to the shrine. The shrine is literally a ritual place, a ritual site, and the idea is that this is where the fire linking ritual takes place. So obviously you go down, it takes you to the teleporter, because as we see there's like this wormhole portal that the gods have created, so you can just go down beneath Firelink Shrine, go through this wormhole doorway, and it'll take you all the way to the Kiln of the First Flame, which is somewhere deep underground that we don't get to go to conventionally, right?
Yeah.
And the idea is that, okay, so you can then have them sacrificed for the fire linking. Now, this isn't the same thing as fire linking as we know today, right? Because the idea with fire linking, what does it mean to link the fire? It means to inherit the flame.
Yes.
That's what the Japanese is getting at. You inherit the flame, and it becomes relevant with the Lords of Cinder. But as far as we're concerned, that isn't quite happening yet. What's happening right now, as we see, is there's not just a Lord vessel that you need to fill up in order to get the souls to open the doorway. That's not a thing yet. What we have is a bunch of Lord vessels in similar cups that are clearly being used to collect souls. So the idea is you take criminal elements out of New Londo and you just sacrifice them, right? Because, no one's going to complain if the criminals get sacrificed.
Yes,
and their souls are being used to help gather up these souls needed to fuel the fire.
But they're not enough.
Yeah, well, this is the problem, is that it's a great system, right? You get rid of all the criminal elements, all the good ones stay there, and eventually, all the undead are going to be in one place where Gwyn can watch them, and the gods can have a firm control over things, right? It's by proxy through the Four Kings, but basically they still get to have control over it. Lloyd's out there in the world of man making sure that these good undead go to New Londo, and all the other ones that go crazy, they're gone. All the humans out in the world of man are happy, so that way they're still going to stay loyal to the gods, and all the heathen elements are going to be scrubbed out of society, both physically and metaphorically. So it's like everything seems to be fine. This is a great ingenious system. Gwyn's politicking is, again, superb. But the problem is, we're not getting these souls fast enough. The fire's kind of fading faster than we get enough souls strong enough to fuel this giant, most powerful flame in existence that came first before all others, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit of an issue. So what are we going to do? Well, this is where Gwyn comes up with the idea of, okay, I'm the guy with the most powerful soul, and I'm the only guy here with the soul apparently worthy of inheriting the flame, taking on this fire, and using myself as fuel. So I'll go to this bonfire that we've set up in the kiln, right? And I will then link myself from that bonfire to the first flame, and I will be able to keep the fire alive just long enough so that way my system plays out and everything works, right? Like that's Gwyn's plan at this point. It's like, okay, sounds good, and think about it this way. It's like, why would Gwyn want to sacrifice his life if he's this vain, arrogant guy who is all about power and ruling and control, right? Well, it's like, well, listen, he's at a point where if the Age of Dark happens, he loses everything, and he's going to have to live to see everything he's built just collapse before his eyes. So if it's that, or sacrifice himself and basically spin himself as this great heroic martyr who, he's no longer just the king. The localization sort of scrubs this out because they just call him Lord Gwyn in the script, but everyone in dialogue refers to him not just as the king, he's the great king, he's the great lord. And the idea is that he becomes the great lord of sunlight because the idea of a Lord of Cinder is a king of kindling. You become you become kindling for the flame, and this makes you a king. Now Dark Souls 2 expands on this concept a lot more, and the basic idea, of course, is that what is a king? It's not like this capacity you're born with per se. The idea that Dark Souls 2 comes with as an answer is a king is just someone who is able to effectuate their will, and decide their fate, not just their own, but the fate of the world, right? So the true king, with to be a true king, you have to become a Lord of Cinder or a Dark Lord, because these are the kings who decide the fate of the direction that the world goes. They're the ones with the most power. They're the ones who can effectuate their will to the most maximum degree.
When you gain suzerainty of the flow of the world itself, then you are the king.
Right, and Koth calls this the natural order, right? That Gwyn imposes himself that is a perversion of the natural order. What he means by this is the logic of the world. And in Confucianism, this term for logic has this idea of a principle to the universe, right? So the idea, as Gwyn, again, there's this idea that Koth says because of localization that, like the pygmy had this plan for like the Dark Lord and all this stuff, and then the flames did fade and only the dark remained. And with that, there was like, it was the age of men of dark, right? Or something like that, right? He doesn't actually say that. The Japanese is just him speaking, eventually, he's saying like, the pygmy had this plan, right? Eventually fire fades and then only the dark remains. And then in that case, there would be an age of men, of dark, right? So this is the pygmy's plan, right? This is what the pygmy's going through. This is what he plans for the future. Isn't something that happened. It's something that he predicts will happen and probably will happen if not for Gwyn coming in and saying, no.
Yeah.
So the idea with Gwyn is that by imposing the seal of the ring of fire on men and shackling their dark, by linking the fire contrary to and preventing fire from just going out and allowing the age of dark to come, he is binding the world to stay in this present state, and it's forever stagnant. And this is something that Gwyn this is basically like this is sort of like if shackling the dark was the first sin, you could argue that this is the second sin that Gwyn does, or a continuation of the first sin.
Yeah. Before he actually goes to the kiln to burn himself, though, he does something pretty big. We talked earlier about how it is, you have all these barbarian, these tribesmen, these sorts of malcontents begin to like attempt to gain power, begin to like show their hands, begin to resist gods, and because they get like the sense that, oh, darkness is on the rise, fire is going out. But the problem is, fire is still significantly stronger than you. And
the fire's not, it's going out, it hasn't gone out yet, right?
Yeah, and we have now another rebellion that Gwyn needs to squash before he can, leave this mortal coil, and that is, of course, the Witch of Izalith.
Yes, that's a very important bit.
That's
right?
your favorite story in Dark Souls?
Probably. Izalith is very near and dear to my heart. It was the first one I talked about when I entered the English community, because it's one that the localization completely butchers, and it's such an important part. But again, this is not an Izalith podcast, this is a Gwyn podcast. So what's worth saying here is that the notion that Izalith is like, the first flame is fading, what do we do, I'm so desperate, I know, I'll create my own first flame, and then we can replace it with the old one. That doesn't work. That just logically in the cosmology, you can't do that. The first flame is the first flame. But the point is that's the common assumption people have. And then, she failed, she messed up because she was so desperate and she was rushing this and all that stuff, right? She didn't properly, she didn't do the proper, like, scientific method or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then all of this didn't work out. And then, oh my gosh, now there are these demons, and these demons are these terrible monsters. And now Gwyn and Anor Londo have to go in and save everyone from the demons, right? And then, this is the common, assumption going back when the game first came out. Again, that's all localization. I've gone on a past podcast. Abyssal Archive will cover this in detail. Simplify things.
I recommend the Sinclair lore episode you did talking about this.
Yeah. We're getting Sin's getting a lot of name drops today.
Yeah, he's always name dropping the two of us, so it's fine. We should note. I'll let you explain, but it's not that she's trying to replace the first flame. It's that Nido got the soul of death. That's the power that it had, and so that's the affinity that he develops. The Witch of Izalith got the soul of life, so that's the affinities he developed. And
we see this, of course, with the fire she creates, right?
Yeah.
When she uses her Lord Soul to create the flame of chaos, it creates this flame which creates life. Now the life is grotesque, it's parasitic, it's got all these things because obviously it's not the first flame, but she's trying to create her own first flame. Yeah, because again,
what I'm saying is that's that affinity that drives her, that you don't need to connect that to the first flame. It doesn't have to be that I'm trying to replace it. It's more just I want to have my own one.
Yeah, because she's upset, as we see. She's a witch, right? She's a witch who learns flames, who invents flame sorcery and all this stuff, right? Because her whole thing is okay. And before, when they were simple tribesfolk, she was probably doing some dark studies and stuff. That's why in Dark Souls 3, when you get the Izalith catalyst, they have a bit of compatibility with the dark and stuff, right? But then she found fire, and she's like, "Ooh, I like this thing." Again, if the lords were all captivated by the flame that they saw, she was especially captivated. And the point being is that she developed this entire civilization off of her mistake. She was experimenting, she had all these tests that was being done, and you know what? She messed up. And she ended up turning herself into this seedbed of chaos that's this kind of creating all these demons. But you know what? She wanted a life-giving flame. She wanted this mastery of power of fire and life and all that stuff. And she got it. And she's able to build a whole civilization around that. Yeah. And there's humans that are involved, and
she got her fire under control eventually.
Yeah, and she got to do what she's always wanted, which was create pyromancy, the ability to hold fire in your hand, to not have to use a catalyst to wield it. You can just hold it directly, to be able to touch it and feel it, right? So, like, she again, all of this is something that, again, like, if Gwyn is always building on his successes, Aisleth always builds on her failures. And she's able...
Yeah?
Yeah, that's the idea, right? She tries to turn success out of failure. Gwyn, he just, he ups from one success to the other, and if not for that damn logic of this universe, he would have gotten away with it too.
I was gonna say though, he's kind of always building on his own failures too, though.
Well, he's got the one big failure he didn't see coming.
Yeah,
he bet on the wrong soul.
And Gwyn, of course, doesn't take lightly to anybody who threatens to uproot the sort of prestige of divinity that he has exalted to his own clan. He doesn't like Big Hat Loken because Big Hat Loken is somebody who systemizes magic and makes it available for people to do, and it's like, you shouldn't be doing that because it takes away from the glory of the gods. The Witch of Isolith...
Right, sorcery is good, right? But what Logan goes the step further, and what makes him so special to modern day sorcerers, is that he doesn't believe in divine mysteries and all that stuff, right? Like, oh, there's knowledge that only God knows. Oh, please, any man can study the world and learn all of its secrets, right? Says. Like, hollow, please. So, like, but the idea is like, these gods, they're not gods, they're medials. We humans, we could learn and master our own arts by ourselves. We don't need these so-called gods in order to teach us. In order to like have these secrets that we have to learn through miracles and faith, we can reason and understand them for ourselves, right? Yeah. And Aisleth is a similar vein, and we see with pyromancy, she had humans there who she was teaching pyromancy, fear the flame and all that stuff, that her and Quaylana and all her sisters were doing, right? So all of that was happening, and that was fine. Like Gwyn was like okay with that, like it doesn't hurt us because we're all in alliance and we're all agreed. And again, going back to the original point we made, as long as you're not actively opposing us, we're fine with you not being necessarily following all our teachings to the letter. Like, you can be a little heretical, just be that heretical that isn't, being loud about it, right?
Yeah. Witch of Isolith decides to do something different, though.
Yeah, she basically decides, okay, daughters, we're going to challenge the lords. It's like, Gwyn, your Age of Fire is coming to an end. You're not going to have that big flame and its light on your side. But you know what? In case you didn't notice, I created my own first flame, and I built my society around that. Now, whether or not this would have worked long-term the way she thinks, obviously it's still a flame, and even then, it's still technically connected to the first flame in some way, so we don't know if there's a meaningful difference or whatever. But at least as far as Aisleth is concerned, she sees herself like, this is an absolute win. If the Age of Fire ends, then it's just going to be an Age of Chaos, because then I'm the only one with a first flame.
Yeah. And Gwyn doesn't take that very kindly. In Bloodborne, we talked about the idea of, the original hunters under Gurman, they wore light armors and they used light weapons. Mobility was key. But as the beasts got bigger and bigger, and as Ludwig began to take over, you get the idea of like big weapons. You get to the Kirkhammer, you get to Ludwig's Holy Blade. That's also seen here with the Silver Knights versus the Black Knights, because the Black Knights are especially equipped to deal with giant demons.
Right. So what happens is that when you're the Silver Knights and you're fighting dragons, okay, well, you got this issue of their stone scales, right? This hard armor they essentially have. So you got to pierce through that armor. So they get these they develop these thin spears that with these cross guards, so that way we can really thrust into the bodies with all of our strength and our body weight, and we can really force ourselves to pierce that armor and get in, right? That's how we're going to pierce through them rather than try to cleave through them. When you don't have those stone scales, though, the only problem is that you have to worry about that meaty girth, right? That hard, thick flesh, those big bones. That's the stuff that you now have to worry about cutting through, right? So you're not going to worry about piercing so much. You're going to create these big, heavy weapons which do so. So that's the idea. Gwyn sees that Aisleth is essentially saying, you know what? I challenge your authority. What are you going to do about it, punk? Your Age of Fire is about to end. You can't do anything in these last few weeks or days or who knows how long before you lose everything. And Gwyn's like, you want to try me, bitch?
It was in that moment that the Witch of Isolith realized she messed up.
Oh, she messed up.
He's a fading power, but he's still the reigning power.
Exactly, right? Like, again, it's going out, hasn't gone out yet. And so Gwyn develops these special weapons and armor just to go against Chaos Demons. Now, you talked about this in your video. What is the significance of the localization change where it says, the Black Knights, they fought Chaos Demons and then their armor turned black, right? Like, that's a completely different from what actually happens as confirmed in interviews and things like this. And the Japanese community understood this is because the wording is the shield of, they who once fought Chaos Demons. It's black. It's now, now we see that the shield is blackened and it has fire resistance. It's not telling us that that's the reason why those events happen. It's sort of just a subordinate clause attached to it. And then you would say, well, why bring up the subordinate clause? Because it's connected in a different way. Say Dark Souls 3, the Flynn ring has something similar where it talks about how Flynn, who's said to have had the power of wind at his side, was a hero of the was a hero for the poor and like the small and poor people, right? Like the idea is like, he was the man for the little guy, right? Well, that's not because he had the power of wind. Everyone's like, oh my god, he has wind power, so he's our hero. No. The idea is that Gwyn is this chivalric Robin Hood archetype, right? Like the chivalric thief. So he, as a Robin Hood, he's like sort of rob from the rich, steal for the poor type of deal, and that's why he's considered their hero. He's like he's the man for the little guy, for the poor person.
Yeah, but, and also because he was probably named for Errol Flynn, and those people were big into action adventure serials from the 60s.
Yeah. So what happens with the wind aspect is that, well, it tells you, okay, well, if you're going to be a hero, you need to have certain success rate, right? And you do that by being strong. So what power did Flynn have that helped him be worthy of being called a hero? Oh, and come to the poor people's attention? Well, he had that wind power, right? So it's sort of this ancillary thing that's related, but not directly in the way. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. That's just the way the Japanese language is. So the Japanese community always understood that this was, okay, well, it doesn't make sense for it to be that the Black Knights have all this armor, right? But then they go against the Chaos Demons and that turns them black. And then later on they get burned by the first flame and that turns them to ash and doesn't affect their armor at all, right? Like if the entire armor turns black going against Chaos Demons and their flames, then the first flame, which is obviously clearly more powerful, that's turning them to ash, should absolutely melt their armor. It just doesn't make sense that way. So it's very obvious that the idea is that the armor was made with fire resistance to deal with the Chaos Demons and their flames, right? And because the flame magic and all that stuff and the flame weapons and everything, like it needs some fire resistance, right? But it also needs to be big, thick, and heavy in order to deal with the demons as far as weapons are concerned, right? And you know what? We need these weapons and these armor to not have any cloth or anything attached like we do with the Silver Knight armor, because you don't want cloth catching on fire and stuff, right? So everything is designed so that way this armor can deal with the Chaos Demons and any fire they might throw at them.
And it's more like demonic in appearance versus the Silver Knight's angelic visage.
Right. Yeah, you see demon horns instead of angel wings on the helmets, right? So, and the idea is, okay, when later on they turn into Black Knights when they fight when they go to the kiln and they get burned. When Gwyn links the fire, he burns up, and the Black Knights, the Silver Knights still, but the Silver Knights who fought in the Chaos War and didn't change out of their armor yet, they're turning now into quote unquote Black Knights because they turned to ash. But the armor, it had that fire resistance for facing chaos, and it was apparently a really good fire resistance because the armor doesn't melt at all; it just turns black. So. That's the point being made. And Miyazaki and the concept artists for the Black Knights are basically gushing how they're so happy that the Japanese, again, they're talking in the context of a Japanese interview for the Japanese community, they were able to connect the dots and understand this happened when they were burned by Gwyn, when Gwyn linked the fire and stuff like that, right?
Explicitly. They don't mince words on this one. This is explicitly what happened.
Yeah, and again, like I say, this is again another thing where the localization sort of ends up. Localizers try to make things more natural sounding in English, but sometimes they misinterpret what the information is actually trying to get at, and it ends up giving the wrong impression. This happens, of course, across the games, and this again is what happens in this case. So that again, just to clarify why that bit is important.
Yeah,
but still, they have this special.
For a long time, I've been campaigning for Miyazaki to write his games in English first, so that we don't have these issues.
just make it so that way the community's writing it as English first for once, right?
Anyways,
so Aislith thinks that she can one up Gwyn, and Gwyn says no, stay down.
And he basically tears the legs off of whatever society she could have possibly built. He wipes out the human population.
Right, that's a huge thing, right? Because Gwyn, again, as you talked about earlier, all these heathens are rising up, and now he's dealing with Aislith, a demon-human medial society is sort of now rising up. Well, what's going to cause these humans who are told, oh yeah, fear the flame, don't revere it blindly or anything like that, you gotta fear it a little bit and be a little, like, kind of think about this, even though you really want to, touch the flame instinctively, right? It's like, okay, well, if that's the case, that's not too far off from them basically going, why do we need flame? Why not this dark thing? It seems more natural. So Gwyn's obviously dealing with all these dark rebellions, and now he's got a giant kingdom run by a lord with a bunch of these humans that could at any time suddenly realize, hey, wait a second, maybe we should join in with this whole dark rebellion thing. Like, he's obviously paranoid about this. So this is why Aislith's like, I have to get rid of this before anything else, right? Yeah. And then he goes in with his knights all specially equipped for this. They roll over Aislith. They get absolutely destroyed. Kill a few kill one of the daughters along the way and all that. And it's like, listen, Aislith, I taught you how to become fire keepers and deal with your own undead problems. See the fair lady and stuff like that. So it's like, oh, I've done all this stuff, but you know what? You just had to betray me. We had a nice little thing going with this alliance. So now I'm killing all the there's no humans left in Aislith after Gwyn goes through. As we can see, they're all dead. Yeah. And with that now, it's just Aislith, the witches, and a bunch of demon warriors. So good luck rebuilding your society without engineers and blacksmiths and all this stuff that helped keep things going, right? And again, this is clever on Gwyn's part. Once the humans are gone, the principal threat he's concerned about, why is he going to waste time dealing with getting rid of the rest of these rebellion? He'd rather just sue for peace and just say, okay, we end this here. Now, it's obvious that he sues for peace because, one, the demons are still around, he doesn't get rid of them all. And two, as we see, the demons don't do anything up until very recently. It's only, as the undead merchant tells us, it's only recently now that we're dealing with this issue of Capra demon and Taurus demon coming up, and Quelaag and the Fair Lady have moved in and started taking over Blighttown and things like that. And obviously the Undead Burg is a more recent development, so it's not been around forever and anything like that. So Gwyn's basically just like, okay, the demons just sort of implicitly understand, they don't leave. And cut dialogue tells us, okay, Quelaag just outright says that, yeah, there's this pact that we have, like, you're not supposed to invade us, we don't invade you, everything's good, right? So again, in-game, it's implied, cut content makes it even more obvious that clearly Gwyn just basically works out a peace treaty, and like you said, Aislith's been cut down at the knees, like, she and her society are gonna slowly die off on their own, which is why Quelaag and stuff are so desperate to try to, go out into the human world, break the pact, and try to revive their dying civilization. Mm-hmm. So Gwyn's dealt with this problem. He's not going to waste more time. He's got a fire to save now.
Yes, and he does enslave some of the demons, though. Like, we get the Sanctuary Demon, Sanctuary Guardian. We have the Asylum Demons taken as prisoners of war. Not a lot maybe to dig into there.
Like, it's basically all you have to know is, like, Asylum Demons, like, one of them's obviously a Demon Fire Sage, like, because the Demon Fire Sages are priests, so it's like the Flame Priests, and they were the first demons who became, like, like, who learned all the sorcery arts before pyromancy was invented and stuff like that, after, demons are starting to be born because of the Bed of Chaos and all that. So it's like, okay, so, like, Gwyn takes one of those down, another regular demon, and they basically become prisoner of war. As we see them basically sent off to staff the prison for the later undead systems that the gods set up later on. But as far as Gwyn is concerned, okay, we'll take a few of you as prisoners of war. The Sanctuary Guardian and the Batwing Demons are more closer to what we see with the idea of betrayal, right? Because the Batwing Demons, they get a little bit of that light soul, right? Like, they get a cut of Gwyn's power, and they now have light. And they get like lightning. There's their spears, which are clearly demon spears carved from the bones of their kindred, like many of the other demons. There, though, now have lightning spears, right? And the Sanctuary Guardian, it's shooting. It's a holy beast, quote unquote, now. So it's it's got lightning power. It shoots, but again, and we can infer that the Sanctuary Guardian is, of course, a demon, because they make a point about how the fact that it has the combination of multiple animal traits and how it makes it very close to the demon. So again, very obviously making the connection there and all that. So we have this idea of, okay, so Aislith basically gets some of her own people either betraying her or getting basically imprisoned and enslaved. But again, once the humans are gone, Gwyn's basically happy. He'll take home the spoils of war he's got now. He's not gonna like go all the way, right? His big concern is, okay, we need to deal with the first flame fading imminently.
And before he does that, of course, he goes back to Anor Londo. He sort of reorganizes the power structures there, divvies up his power, divvies up responsibilities between his people. And who does he choose to lead Anor Londo in his absence?
Oh, well, that's the first. That happens to be his firstborn. So, because the idea with Gwyn in item descriptions, they say about how, he gave his power to the gods and to his clan, right? So, obviously, one and the same. Now, obviously, that doesn't clarify us. Okay, which gods, which clan? Was it like everybody got a little piece of the power? The series doesn't really try to clarify too much. Now, we know it's not Ornstein or the Four Knights aren't included in this, because even though the English tells us that Ornstein's soul was like, I think it's something to the effect of like, oh, it was a soul that the King Lord Gwyn gave to the Four Knights or something like that. That isn't actually what it says. The Japanese just says it's the soul of one who is a member of Gwyn's Four Knights. So again, like the Four Knights aren't getting a piece of the soul to share. Ornstein's soul is his soul. Well, obviously Dark Souls 3 sort of qualifies that, but that's besides the point. The idea is that that's a separate discussion. But the point is, like, okay, the idea is, like, that's just supposed to be Ornstein's soul. It has nothing to do with Gwyn handing out his power or stuff. Maybe he gave a little bit of the power that gave Ornstein and, like, the other medials a bit of a sunlight affinity, but that's it, right? Like, nothing more than that. This has nothing to do with the power that he's handing out at this juncture. Right now, he's handing out all the power he has, because, he's off to die. He needs to make sure that all his property is, like, given out to the proper folks that need it.
By power, they're talking about, like, political power, right?
Well, more than just that, we're also talking about, like, for example, the barriers set up. The barriers that we see that are later used to keep us from getting to the various people for the Lord Souls and stuff, like Nito and Aislith and etc. These come later. These aren't done by Gwyn himself, because, again, it's stated that it's by the power of the Great Lord that these barriers exist, not by Great Lord. There was a cut line for that, actually, before.
Right. And
then the point being is, of course, Gwyn gave out his power. Now, what you're talking about, though, is very true, because in the case of Gwyn's crown, when Gwyn was done, he divvied out all his power, his property, everything that he owned and used and all that stuff, right? Once he's all done, there's only 3 things he has left. His greatsword, the clothes on his back, and his crown. But the localization tells us, it's the crown, it's a symbol of the monarch and all that. But it's like, no. People always misinterpret that to mean, like, it's talking about monarchy, because, obviously a crown represents monarchy and all that stuff. But no, the Japanese is clear. It's talking about how it's a symbol of Gwyn. It represents Gwyn. You see that crown and you're like, oh, hey, you're Gwyn. Right? like everyone, like, it's on all his statues, everything, right? Like, you see that crown and you know that is the crown of Gwyn. But it's, as the description tells us, it's bereft of power. It doesn't have any power. And power, chikara, means, it can refer to, like, generic power, like magic power and stuff like that. But in this context, it's very clear it's referring to authority. It's referring to your political power. Because the idea is, like, at this, already, when Gwyn is leaving to link the first flame, that crown has no authority. It has no power over anyone. He can't suddenly decree. Well, he probably could, but the point is, he can't, like, legally, in terms of the hierarchy of his kingdom, suddenly decree it, because he's no longer the king. He has given that authority and deferred it over to his firstborn, right?
Yes. And we can explore the case of the ceremonial casket because the English community got really hung up on this idea that Gwyn personally exiled him.
That's nowhere in the script, and it's very obviously not the case. Again, Koth in the Japanese script tells us that he bound his sons to guide the humans, and he's only got 2 of them, Gwyndolin and the firstborn. So it's explicitly he has his plural sons handling that. So Gwyndolin and Gwyn, again, Gwyn knows about Gwyndolin, duh. So
Yeah.
the idea being is that these two, okay, you're in charge of now making sure humans, like Lloyd is obviously over there doing things in person, but you make sure that Lloyd and the Way of White and all that, all the humans are staying as we want them, right? Like, Gwyn's like, I set up this system, don't screw it up.
So yeah, he binds his sons to do it, and the case of the ceremonial casket is what seals the deal on this one.
Yeah, because the firstborn, yeah.
There is no way for the nameless king, like Gwyn's firstborn, to leave the sunlight blade to Miracle on the casket prior to Gwyn disappearing.
Right, like obviously, if you're gonna have this ceremonial grave, because obviously it's not his actual grave, because Gwyn is in the kiln, right? So it's clearly a ceremonial grave, like so many do. So this is like a ceremonial mausoleum built under the church and the royal manor and all that. And its idea is like, okay, well, for that manor to exist, Gwyn has to die, and then they build, or maybe they're building it concurrently or something. But the point is that the firstborn becomes the king. That's why in Dark Souls 3, he's the nameless king. He has a crown just like Gwyn's and stuff like that, because he was made the king of Anor Londo after Gwyn was gone. Gwyn was the head of the gods. Well, now he lets his firstborn be the head of the gods, and when the firstborn is gone, Lloyd takes over as the head of the gods. So
yeah.
The point being is that, and as we see, Gwyndolin later moves in, and Gwyndolin's like, oh, what's this doing on here? How dare you? And he puts because obviously Firstborn's disgraced by this point, and forced to leave, and he puts the Miracle inside a chest instead of leaving it there on the coffin, right? And then he has this special magic, which only his priests with their special magic rings are able to get through the illusion and stuff like that, right? So all of this is sort of playing into the idea that, yes, Gwyn did not exile and banish and wipe away his son. He's not like, oh my god, my son is such a disgrace. In fact, the fact that the firstborn leaves that lightning blade Miracle, the sunlight blade actually, on the casket is his message to his father as he leaves, right? Because his dad's dead, he can't talk to him personally, so he just leaves that Miracle there as a sort of it's sort of like his parting words to his dad in a symbolic fashion.
But it's not just his sons that get a new job after he leaves. Guinevere was tasked with giving the Lord Vessel to the eventual heir. Right. To this fire linking.
Right, because now Gwyn is going to become essentially, in becoming Lord of Cinder, he now also has to becomes the guardian of the first flame, right? Mm-hmm. So now they can't do the original plan, which is, okay, just gather a bunch of souls and then we'll dump it in the flame and it'll fuel it, right? Now it's got to be this thing where it's like, okay, we need someone strong enough to defeat the most powerful being with the most powerful soul. Oh boy, this is going to be so much fun, right? So it's like, and if you're gonna create a being who has the soul and thus the power to be able to defeat the most powerful being, he has the soul to basically just do the linking himself, right? So this is how we get the idea of now a lineage of lords of kings of kindling, right? So now, like, it's no longer just we as the chosen undead in Dark Souls 1 become the first in what the series established as this lineage of lords who continually just sort of replace it, because again, it's the most logical system once Gwyn links the fire, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as part of that, Gwyn leaves behind the Lord Vessel. Now, the Lord Vessel is, again, a vessel of the king. The word for vessel also means a capacity in Japanese. So there's this idea of, okay, do you have the capacity to be a king? Can you match Gwyn, right? And that's why the idea is, okay, the Lord Vessel is the key in order to get to the kiln through the wormhole. So we need powerful souls, and if you put enough souls in there for it to match Gwyn's power, then we can infer that you probably have a soul of about that size yourself, and you can now go through the wormhole, challenge Gwyn, kill him, and then you can now link the fire and it become the new lord, right? And this is the whole thing with Frant being the king seeker and all this. And okay, the Lord Vessel is this this glorified measuring cup that Gwyn leaves behind for Guinevere to take up, because Guinevere, ever since her dad left this thing behind, she's been waiting to give it to a chosen undead, and that's the whole revelation thing where she now just sits pretty in Anor Londo, or she's supposed to sit pretty there in Anor Londo and just be ready to tell people, hey, you know what your big mission is, why you undead exist? Because, again, they have to code everything in this idea of providence, and the gods have this control and manipulating the fates of men and all this, right? Like, they try to pretend they're these gods when they really aren't. Again, goes back to our point at the beginning. And the idea is like, the reason why you undead exist, it's all part of this providential existence in order to link the fire and banish the dark and revive the flame that we also love, because you love the warmth and the light and all that, right? So she's supposed to just be this, again, she's the most popular goddess. She, obviously, easy on the eyes.
Hey.
So So like she's the person that she wants. She's supposed to be the spokesperson to the person once we confirm they're a hero, and that's going to be sorted out with trials and stuff, right? And that's what New Londo is supposed to do, and then later Ulasil, and then later the Undead Burg. So like,
Yeah.
this is again, Gwyn set everything up so like even when the specific plan with New Londo fell apart, his sons could keep things, organized and create like a new system that basically served the same function. And obviously, eventually, that becomes the whole kill certain lords to fill the lord's soul. Obviously, New Londo. Obviously, the plan can't be to kill the four kings yet, and the four kings can't be these traitors who've been sealed away and stuff at this point, because obviously, at this juncture, the four kings are now part of this system, right? So the idea is like, oh yeah, I'm gonna kill the people who I specifically gave a soul in order to show my trust in them, even though not as much trust, and I'm gonna have them and all the lords and stuff betray in order to fill this lord's soul. No. This was a later invention with the whole magic door sealing and all that in order to keep us from getting to these people, humans, before the appointed hero was supposed to.
Mm. And this is Gwyn leaves. He burns himself up in that massive. As we established the future Black Knights, they're the Silver Knights. They fought in the war with him. Obviously, Gwyn is the king and everything. He's leading them into battle and stuff. And like sort of this last hurrah, we're so loyal to the king. We're gonna go chase after him as he leaves. And you know what? If he's gonna go sacrifice himself, we'll die with him, right? Like it's the idea of like they have this particular loyalty compared to the other knights who, they fought in the dragon hunts and stuff like that. But times change and they've been working for the royalty in general. And someone has to stay behind and protect the royalty as their bodyguards, right? So like, it's basically just these knights basically decide. And we see this, right? Like the mausoleum for Gwyn, outside of it, there's that circle with Silver Knight little statues on the walls and little, like, clearly, like, memorial plaques and stuff down there. So, like, again, same idea. Yes. And he, like you said, he stays behind in the kiln. He's supposed to test your skill. If you can beat him, you're probably strong enough to link the fire. He's supposed to be a strong boss to test all of your skills, isn't he?
Yeah, that was the idea. That didn't quite work out as Miyazaki planned, though, because Miyazaki didn't realize the only skill you need in Dark Souls is parry.
Yeah. But yeah, he's a pretty aggressive guy if you, like, fight him head on.
Yeah, the problem is that there's the parry aspect, and then also the fact that you're usually going to be over-leveled, especially after the DLC, right? So,
yeah.
He ends up being this boss that feels a bit weaker, and everyone's like, "Oh, that's actually supposed to happen." No. Miyazaki says in the interview, he wanted Gwyn to be strong, and he's so disappointed. In fact, he was so disappointed that in Dark Souls 3, he made sure Soul of Cinder couldn't be parried. So when you're fighting, and you see that with Gwyn, right? Like Gwyn gets this sudden fighting game air juggle combo.
Yeah,
he's like, Gwyn is gonna be strong this time.
That's the thing with Pinwheel. I think Pinwheel is one of the best bosses in the game, and I get so much flack for this. But like, if you finish Undead Burg entirely, and then go to Blighttown and finish that, and then you go to Sense Fortress and then Orlando, and after that you encounter Pinwheel. Pinwheel is a pushover.
Yeah.
But if you get the Rite of Kindling before going to Anne Orlando, Pinwheel is like he's a decently like scaled up boss.
Well, I would still say he's still a little too weak. I think the problem was that originally the plan was for you to go to the catacombs in the early game. There's a lot of content related to that, and obviously Patches is an example of what's left behind. But it's very obvious that originally the plan was you could go anywhere, and then eventually they decided, oh no, we don't want this. We want to filter people to go to the Undead Burg so they can progress the plot, right? So it's clear that they scaled up the skeletons, but they didn't scale up Pinwheel, right? Because, scaling up the skeletons, you just change a few stats, right? And then all the skeletons everywhere are going to be now much harder, right? And that's why when you go try to go through the catacombs, you get swarmed by all these skeletons, which are like taking like 100 hits to kill or something like that, ridiculous like that. And then you're like, okay, I don't go this way, and then eventually the game naturally filters you to go through the aqueduct.
You know what I really don't like is in Dark Souls 2 and 3, I feel like the damage values and the health should have been like represented with smaller and smaller numbers to sort of represent that the actual like the world is sort of fading, and a strong person in Dark Souls 3 is like, it's kind of like in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, where you read the Silmarillion and you have like Fingolfin and all these characters, and they're doing these amazing feats, and then you read Lord of the Rings and it's like, oh, oh yeah, there's not a lot of magic in the world anymore, huh? And I would have liked that for like Dark Souls 3. Like a strong weapon is a weapon that deals like 70 points of damage. But it's like, but like the boss health is also scaled around that being like the same stat, whereas like the world is gradually like getting worse and worse.
Well, you've made your point before of how you like the idea of Gwyn as like being a weak boss. So even if it's accidental, you prefer that in some ways. And I take a different position, but I agree with you. There's some value into kind of showing how things are pathetic, but like as far as Miyazaki is concerned, Soul of Cinder is more of what he wants. The idea that you can't just hard counter Gwyn with parrying. You actually kind of get to see him do all these cool moves that show that even as fire is fading and it's about to go out, it's still extremely powerful, right? You know, it's the idea like, you know, a flame still burns brightly even as it's like about to kind of burn out, right? And maybe even brighter because it's about to burn out.
Yeah.
And you see this idea of like Gwyn himself. He has this power and he's strength, right? So the idea is like, okay, like Gwyn is going to be strong, but the music and just his behavior and his appearance sort of tell us that, you know, he's kind of pathetic.
Yeah, it's not and it's so interesting because it evokes what I was saying, where it's like, what was this guy in his peak? Like I would have had no ability to actually deal with that if this is him hollowed out.
But, like, imagine, like, as a, like, again, because the idea is, like, he's not human, so he doesn't hollow because he doesn't have the undead curse, right? But as far as, like, thematically speaking, it's the same idea. His soul is burning from the first flame, those powerful flame in existence. And he's the only soul that could manage to do it. And that's obviously going to drain you. So he has this very zombified look, and his eyes are all, again, hollowed out. And he's basically just he has been reduced to just the singular will, the thing that's most important to him, to keep the fire alive, protect the flame, right?
Yes.
The fire keepers, all of that. Everything revolves around this idea of we must protect the flame. And that sort of shows, and again, combined with the music and stuff, you have this idea like if you're doing the ending most people are going to go through on just a blind playthrough is, okay, like I have this special mission I'm chosen by the gods in order to go through this special mission. I've proven myself through these various trials, and now I'm going to be now the heir to Gwyn. I'm going to become the new great lord, and then I'm going to succeed him as a Lord of Cinder, right? Like that's the idea. And then you link the fire and you take on the flame, and the music, like the pling plom plom, right? That is sort of giving you this sense of like, you know, it's like this tragic hero of Gwyn, right? And it's like, it's like, oh my lord, it's like you can rest now, king. You've done enough, right? Like you've done your part, right? Like it almost has this kind of like bittersweet moment to it, right? And that's kind of plays into the fact of how actual like raffle stomp lol easy Gwyn is as a boss. But then obviously if you're going through the Age of Dark ending though, it just sort of emphasizes how like pathetic it is. Like after all of this is what you are, this hollowed out man that after everything that's happened, after you're reduced to basically nothing, you're this strong warrior, but your mind is gone. You are just your desire to keep this flame alive, because that's been your entire life, your entire obsession forever. This control, this power, it represents everything to you. Because you imagine you are the flame, you are the god, you are the one that controls everything, right? And it's sort of like, it sort of gives this idea that, like, you're just pathetic, man. And this is a guy idea. He just becomes this sort of pathetic villain that you can't help but, like, hold disdain for. When you peel back the layers and see, oh, Gwyn has been manipulating and changing and lying to us from the start. Yeah,
but, the fire linking ending is still the ending most people go with. And unfortunately, that's the bad ending.
That's the canon end. Well, it's the canon ending.
It's the canon ending,
right? Because we don't get sequels if the Age of Fire ends, so we got to keep it going. And
I feel like, no, Dark Souls 2 doesn't make sense if in the Age of Fire. I feel like they kind of tried to brush aside any sort of canon connection to the first one a lot more than the third one.
Again, Dark Souls 2 does assume that the Age of Fire ending happens and stuff like that.
Yeah,
and I think part of the motivation for us not getting one of the big complaints, of course, of Dark Souls 2 is how it reduces the choices up until Scholar, where it gives you a non-choice. But the idea is that the game basically stops short of you going to the kiln and facing the Lord of Cinder. And my sense is part of that was because they didn't want to create a scenario where you would probably be fighting your old character, right? So that they don't want to canonize who the old chosen undead is, so they're going to basically just kind of stop short there, end it, and then whether you choose the light or dark ending, you can just imagine in your head, right? And I feel Dark Souls 3 gets Dark Souls 3 gets around this by saying, oh, there's been so many Lords of Cinder now that they're all just this amount. The soul of Cinder is now a thing.
I feel like they could have done it though. Just like Ratchet and Clank 3 gave me discounts if I had Ratchet and Clank 2 and Ratchet and Clank 1 saved on my memory card.
I feel like, especially with Dark Souls 2, with all the other problems Dark Souls 2 had,
you know what? I'm gonna cut them a slack.
Like Dark Souls 2 had so many other problems that needed their attention.
But yeah, you have this imposition of a perverse order that stagnates the world.
Yes. You talked about this in the video very great, right? Like the idea is like the world, the flow of time isn't convoluted, it's stagnant. And you use the river example. I will use like a ribbon example. When you like, let's say you have you undo the belt on your bathrobe and let it fall to the floor, it's gonna randomly sort of pile up in like random bits. Like this part is gonna at the beginning gonna overlap in the middle, and this part at the end is gonna overlap with the beginning. Right? It's just sort of like. You have these things where they randomly sort of intersect, and that's the idea with the flow of time. We're still following a quote-unquote linear flow of time, it just we may not experience it linearly. And events in Dark Souls have, as we've just gone over, a clear cause and effect is still in effect.
Yeah.
So... but the idea of the stagnation of the world, of course, is because the fire is fading. So, light is time, and so as the fire fades, its light weakens again, and because of that, we see how that affects the Ring of Fire with the undead, and we see how this affects in that Lordran is in its own dimension, technically speaking, because the idea is that it's in a time bubble where all this weird timey-wimey shenanigans happen, right? And you go over in the video, I think, well enough, so I don't think we need to elaborate, but... The idea of this stagnation is now set as a theme from very early on with Solaire, right? Mm-hmm. And we see in later games how this stagnation theme just obviously by Dark Souls 3 it becomes the main theme, right? Because this idea of trying to, again, like we said earlier, Gwyn binds the world. He tries to keep it in this age of fire well past its expiration date, and. Yes. As a result, Koth is all like talking about the natural order and the logic of the world and all this stuff, right? But the idea is that Gwyn's order is, of course, a false order. It's a perverse order. Ollie, of course, makes a big deal about this. And ultimately, it's going to cause the world to burn. The world will burn out before the fire does at this rate.
Yeah. All right, then. That's a good place, I think, to leave Gwyn lore. Do you want to do a quick Q&A session?
Yeah, let's do it. Rapid fire.
Rapid fire. All right, then. Are there any meaning... Okay, once again, I have neglected to copy the names of the people who asked the questions. I keep doing that. Whatever. Are there any meaningful differences between the original Japanese and English translations that would change how we view Gwyn or interpret his lore? I advise you to listen...
Watch the podcast.
To watch this video. And you can have your answer. But especially from the Ringed City, I don't know, is there anything like especially egregious translation from the Ringed City? Didn't Dark Souls 3 get a better translation?
Yes, generally speaking, the original Demon Souls and Dark Souls are the ones that had the worst translation quality. As I say, those technologies are bleh. Dark Souls 2 you get and Dark Souls 3 it's meh. So it's got problems, but like they're not as egregious or as numerous necessarily.
I think if you're going if you're going to view Gwyn incorrectly from Ringed City, it's probably because of baggage you've brought from previous games. I think the Ringed City does a pretty good job of showing Gwyn as like who the world wants you to think he is.
Well, yeah. Well, who Miyazaki wants you to think he is.
Yeah,
because that's how he's. Yeah, so like Dark Souls 1, like again, it's sort of subtle because the whole point is that you're in this artificial system that's a huge lie, right? And you're being filtered through it in order for the purpose of it. In the purpose of basically serving Gwyn's ends and ambitions, right? Even from beyond the grave. Dark Souls 2, the series is much more open about how you're being lied to by the King of Light and how Shalcor talks about how he's a vainglorious liar and all that. And then Dark Souls 3, obviously, well, he's the final boss again, so it's trying to bring us back to the idea that Gwyn's he's the real villain in underlying this entire series, no matter who else you've been fighting in all their factions and all these things. He's the bad guy that really started all this for these games. And, as far as Ring City is concerned, I can't think off the top of my head anything really egregious localization-wise. Obviously, there's a lot of new stuff introduced here with the idea, of course, the Ring City sort of is taking implications and things from the first game and sort of expanding upon this and codifying it in a more concrete manner. But then he also gets a new daughter. Didn't have Filianor before, so but
Yeah.
again, nothing really on the localization side there. Most of the stuff involving Gwyn is either translated really well or done through the environment, so nothing really to complain about.
All right. Is he referred to as Lord in all languages? No.
Yes, as we talk about, Lord is king, so the idea is
Yeah.
that he is the king. Now, Lord is probably the intended localization because of Lordran, the Lord Land, so the land of the lords. So that, given that name for the area, I'm willing to assume that Miyazaki told the localizers, hey, call this lords, but the kanji is king, and it's understood in the Japanese community when they read that, of course, that when they're calling them lords, they're talking about kings. And obviously, again, as we talked about, it follows this very natural progression of, we go from tribal people to kingdoms and et cetera, right?
Yeah. Is sunlight and the sunlight-related miracles all the same? What?
I think they're asking about if there's a difference between, like, say, when Gwyn is called, like, Lord of Sunlight versus, say, like, Sunlight Miracles and things like that.
Oh.
Terminology-wise, there are some differences. For Abyssal Archive, you'll see me referring to Gwyn as the King of the Sun's Light, because the way it's written, it can be translated as sunlight. There's nothing wrong with the localization doing that. But the terminology is slightly different, say, than when you say read a miracle text and it might be referring to the sunlight. Like sometimes it'll say the light of the sun or the sun's light or sunlight, or it'll actually just have the kanji for sun and light next to each other the same way we do in English. And I translated that when there's a difference from that, I translate it as sun's light just for the sake of pointing out. Plus, there's a slight emphasis, more emphasis on the light aspect in that terminology, right? Because it's the light of the sun. And we see this in Dark Souls 2 when they take out the sun part and he's just the king of light, right?
Yeah.
So, but again, nothing major or meaningful. The idea was sunlight is equivocated to lightning, which again is related to the holy powers and stuff. And again, Abyssal Archive will discuss more of that stuff and how that works in more detail.
Yeah, we can't cannibalize it too much. We're trying to pimp this thing. Was Plin Plon Plin originally written as? I think so. I've never read anything about it, like the music being moved around.
I'm guessing that's a troll post, but yeah, basically.
No, this is the same question, but it might be a joke question.
Yeah, I think as far as I'm aware, any changes in the music were done before release. I don't think they changed between versions.
Yeah. All right.
Before Dark Souls 3, and they reverbed it.
All right. His estrangement with his firstborn, from his point of view, he didn't get estranged from his firstborn. We talked about this.
Yeah.
Did he have his children to influence them into their many positions? Oh, did he have his children to influence them into their purposes? I don't think so. I think he just had kids, and then he's like...
It's somewhat ambiguous in many ways, right? Because he clearly uses his kids as a means to an end, but like you could say that with every parent, right? Like obviously, if you have a kid, you're gonna use them, right?
Yeah.
But I guess the question would be: did he legitimately love his children, or were they just again like free labor?
Yeah.
I
feel like
I think with the way his relationship with his wife and the amount of kids they had, I think there was a legitimate loving relationship there. Obviously Gwyn is arrogant and vainglorious, so the idea that these are his progeny, his spawn, that's gonna obviously play into the relationship, and he obviously isn't always the best dad, especially when it comes to like Gwendolyn and stuff like that. But I would say it's probably a mix of both. He loves him and respects him, but it ties back into his character of his arrogant and his vainglory and all that, and his desire for control and just general selfishness. I think that all ties together. But how much of so? I think that leave it to your interpretation.
We have a lot of questions here about Gwyn's children and about like what we missed out on the relationship between them and Gwyn. I think we've done a pretty good job so far of just like fleshing that stuff out, so I'm not gonna read any more of those. You're gonna record a Gwendolyn podcast with Sinclair?
Yes.
Yeah. Everybody who wants to know more about Gwendolyn, keep your eye on that one. All All right. I saw in Shetani's Lair video that the Japanese boss name for Gwyn was something like Lord of Fuel. I'm curious about what you'll make of that. If that's correct, then that's a more heavy-handed thing than we ever get in the English version. Is it Lord of Fuel?
Okay, so
like...
you'll see people who like throw it through Google Translate. It'll come out as like King of Firewood or something like that.
Yeah, isn't it like
stuff like that?
Yeah.
It's all of those are accurate because the term used, it doesn't literally mean firewood. So like, it isn't like, oh, he's literally called firewood. The word means kindling, fuel, stuff like that, right? I use King of Kindling because it has a nice ring to it generally. And it just sounds better. But again, it's the same concept. Fuel for the fire, kindling, firewood. Same idea, right? Again, just not in the literal sense, it's just talking about the general concept of things you use in order to fuel a fire. In this case, we're using people.
All right, we have a joke question. Is there anything about Gwyn's Van Helsing tape and how Solaire lost it? I think they mean Van Halen tape, so that's not a very good troll. And if I had written down your name, I would have reported your channel for disrespecting this pristine conversation.
I'm sure Solaire meeting Gwyn would be quite the event, I'm sure.
He does meet him at the end when you fight together.
I guess so, you're right. Okay, I take back what I said.
Have you never played this game?
I always do the bad Solaire ending, so I wouldn't know.
Did you know that you can actually get, you can save Solaire without doing the thing in Isolith?
No, I didn't. That's interesting to hear.
Yeah, if you aggro Solaire, then his questline won't advance, so you can just complete Isolith completely. Then if you go to Oswald and get Absolution, you can reset Solaire, but because Isolith is finished, he'll just jump to the next part of his questline.
That's an interesting way to abuse the game mechanics.
I've never done this myself. I read about it. I think it was on one of the wikis. I read about this and I was like, I bet that actually works. I bet this isn't a lie.
That's hilarious.
I watched a series by Plague of Gripes, and he had some excellent questions that I'd love to see if Loki can answer. If Loki and Acer could answer, I would have liked you to post a question that way, but whatever. If Black Dragon Calamite is an ancient dragon, and the dragons were grand creatures that defied desire and didn't really have a sentience the way we know it, is there a reason why Calamite fights us? Well, they do have a sentience the way we know it. Now.
Well, again, it's not completely the way we know it, because the idea is the dragons still have the stone. The archdragons, at least, still have that stone element, right? Like the problem is that the archdragons are half mineral or rock and half life now, because now their sentience is now tied to a soul, because now all consciousness and will and all that is connected to the power of life and disparity and all that. So right. the dragons suddenly find them again. Abyssal Archive will go into this in more detail. We touched on this again very briefly in the beginning of the video, but the basic idea is that the moment the soul came into existence, the dragons were irreversibly changed, and this caused them lots of things, right? Because the idea is that they're everlasting or unperishing. The idea is that they're not supposed to rot or decay. If you left a dragon by itself, it'll never change, right? It'll just stay there as it is forever. But because of the power of life, they start having desires, emotions, feelings, and those things cause them to act in certain ways. And obviously, post-Dragon Hunts, Calamite's got a lot of feelings, probably, about a lot of different things about all these non-dragons in the world.
Yeah, I'll note that, like, Calamite doesn't fight you. Like, the first meeting, he just looks at you, and he's like, he warns you to kind of back off, and then it's you who fights him. And, like...
Right, like, he's just passing through, right? And he's like, oh, you exist. Okay, you're not worth my time. Bye.
Yeah, and then you have to, like, get Goff to, like, shoot an arrow and ground him, and he's like, well, clearly he's going to be mad about that. So, yeah. When does the Artorias DLC take place? Some people say 300 years or so, but Undeadburg isn't even built yet, and it would take more than 300 years for a structure of that size to be built with their technology. I disagree with
giant slaves.
Yeah, I was going to say giant slaves. I disagree with that.
Yeah.
But
Also, it's a fantasy series, so they can decide the timeline is for whatever. But yes, it's real. In terms of the timeline, yes, the events of Ulasil take place 300 to 200 years ago. Closer to the 200 year, because pyromancers are there, and pyromancy gets introduced into the wider world of man thanks to Salaman over 200 years ago. So again, obviously he's got to be out there before. And Undead Burg is very recent. It's the most recent system the gods, specifically Gwyndolin and Frampt, have set up.
All
and
right.
it's only from the past 100 years. Again, we could consistently hear this. Solaire makes mention of the whole time is stagnant thing because he sees quote-unquote legends like Rendell, like Tarkus. These legendary people that are like in the history books of modern folks in the present day from 100 years ago. They're around walking today because of these other worlds intersecting and causing us to do this. Logan's an example of this. Logan, again, is someone who's from he was in the academy and he died at the academy 100 years back, according to Rickard. Same idea. Crestfallen Merchant makes a point of how, for the past 100 years, you got Tarkus and all these things. So these are all people who lived in the 200 to 100 year period between Ulasil and the Undead Burg. They die, they become undead, and now they're being filtered through this system at the Undead Burg. The bell tower, we didn't mention this, but the bell tower that we see in Isleth and stuff, that tower was likely already around before the Undead Burg was a thing. The ruins are much older than the Burg, clearly. They have a similar style, but they're clearly much more worn down and from a different period. It's clear from how the bell functions, it's clearly a watchtower. If if Isleth ever breaks the pact in some way or shows any activity that's suspicious, the gods could just ring the bell, and then the giants in Sen's Fortress and all the people there will hear it, and they'll give word to the gods. It's like, hey guys, Isleth's causing trouble again, and then we have to go and deal with them all over. Right? So, and then it's only later when the Undead Burg is built, like you said, after Ulasil. It's not built there. We see the same spot, no Undead Burg there. But then Ulasil happens 200 to 300 years ago. During that period, up till 100 years ago, Undead Burg gets built. This new system is set up, and then after that, the bell tower, a new bell tower gets built at the Undead Parish, and the system gets repurposed now. So we ring both bell towers, and then you'll be able to get access to Sen's Fortress. The giants know to do that, and then we can go on, right? Like this is all the stuff that Gwyndolin and Frampt have been working on this time.
All right. The next question is not really about Gwyn. All right. Here's one though. Please ask any reference there may be to the mother of Gwyn's children. My own crackpot theory is that Velka was the Dark Moon Queen to Gwyn's Light Sun King. You love Velka.
Yes, I do. I talk about Velka in the Seath podcast with Sin, and we'll talk about her again probably in the Gwyndolin podcast. So
we'll link to those just instead?
Yeah, we'll link to those instead, because it's a question that deserves a full breakdown.
All right. Did Gwyn become hollow after linking the first flame? We talked about this actually. No, but it's a similar. It's the same idea, but he's not hollow. He's not a human.
Yeah. He's not hollow in the sense that he has the undead curse, and then the undead curse ate away at him. Because again, he's not human.
Yeah. Did Gwyn like Gwyndolin? I mean, he named Gwyndolin after himself, but that just says that he likes himself.
Yeah, that's very true. But Gwyndolin, Gwyndolin has always, as we see, Gwyndolin is living in the shadow of his father, both figuratively and literally.
Yeah.
And he has constantly tried to live up to himself while listening to his father's demands. So if Daddy says he's a girl now, he's going to be a girl now. If Daddy says that he wants him to guide the humans in his absence, then he's going to guide the humans. And that's been Gwyndolin's MO. How abusive you consider that is, again, yeah, I think the answer is pretty obvious.
Yeah. What do you two think about people saying that the lore of translated games should be judged differently than what is said in the Japanese version of the game, and that you lore experts complaining about it makes no sense? I mean, the original script is the script that matters.
Yes. Like, it's not, like, again, like, when you do a text critical analysis of the Bible, you don't go to the English version, you go to the Hebrew, you go to the Latin, you go to the Greek, depending on the testaments and stuff like that, right? So, like, you always go to the original text of whatever you do so. And, like, again, I think this is especially obvious in, like, non-English speaking countries. Like, when they get all this stuff from Hollywood and stuff, there's very obvious localization changes and many times errors and things like that. So, like...
Yeah.
And again, it's not just me here in the English community. Like I said, I have counterparts in other countries who've come to me and we've talked, and they've been very grateful for the fact that I have sort of highlighted this for the English side, because the English community is obviously one of the bigger communities, and it's like this is a serious problem, and the English script gives you this confusing, contradictory mess that people are willing to just take Solaire's statement that time is convoluted and use that as the crux to whatever theory they have that just doesn't quite fit together and make sense, right? And then you have the Japanese side, which I'm releasing 2 volumes that goes through all of it, all the text, all the environment, all that, and just by correcting the text, suddenly the entire story comes in a very clear, straightforward, easy to understand manner that's very logical and very methodical.
Mm-hmm. Final question. What's the meaning of life? I mean,
42.
What?
42.
Oh, you with a nerd answer. I feel like, I don't think, like, there is a meaning written in the stars for you to follow. Just, like, you know, find something you enjoy and live a life that, you know, you don't regret. Listen to...
I don't know, Elden Ring tells me that I should find my fate in the stars, right? So
Hey... Maybe you could be like, maybe you could be like one of those rocket boys and create a space company. No, but like, just, you know, just like enjoy yourself, man. You only go around once. Wait, actually, I'll tell you the meaning of life if you subscribe to my Patreon.
The meaning of life is subscribing to Acer. You heard it here first, folks.
It's hidden behind a paywall.
I don't know. Didn't we just talk about people who basically leverage their control over others by saying, if you just give me a devotion, that I will give you these nice things that you want to know and want?
Yeah, but I don't believe in subtext, and I also don't learn lessons. Loki, it's been great having you. The Abyssal Archive. Want to talk about it once more before we sign off?
Like I said, there's 2 volumes of in-depth Dark Souls lore. You're going to hear a lot of stuff that, if nothing else, if you don't agree with my theories, I don't care. But you're really going to want to see some of these translation errors and how much it'll change your analysis of the games themselves and how much the games will suddenly make sense. I will make Dark Souls mundane to you.
I also imagine that if there's any area we've just touched on that you think we could have expanded on, I'm pretty confident you can find that in the books.
Yep, definitely. It's all of Dark Souls 1.
Okay, so I'm gonna link to the books in the description. Loki, it's been great having you. Where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Lokey_DS. That's Lokey_DS. You can also read my content for Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, Demon Souls, a little bit on Dark Souls 1, but again, that's what the Abyssal Archive is for the full story, and of course a little bit of Bloodborne as well, at LokeySouls.com. That's LokeySouls.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks everybody for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye!